Well, I guess we need to call this meeting to order. Mississippi Utility Authority, July 3rd, 2012. Looks like it's 8:30 a.m. to me. We're going to determine the voting members. Melanie Anderson.
Present.
Tommy Clay, present. John Creasman.
Present.
Jeff Fadley. Mr. Hoover. Randy Huckabee.
Present.
Gary Mullenhammer. And Steve Nelson, who is not. So that leaves Melanie, myself, Randy, as the 4 voting members today.
John will be voting until Tommy shows up.
Until Tommy shows up, okay. All right. All right. All right. Needed to approval of the last month's meeting minutes.
I'll make a motion, we accept the minutes as printed.
Have a motion by Mr. Huckabee.
Second.
Second by Mr. Christmas. All those opposed? All those in favor?
Aye.
Carries. I think I did that backwards, but employee recognition. Janet is on vacation, but she's been with us 5 years, so maybe we can get her in next time. Consent agenda. Need to look at it and get an approval of a motion to see if we accept it as is.
It's hard to believe we're 9 months into this thing.
It's my 15th.
I'll make a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Have a motion by Mr. Huckabee to approve.
I'll second.
Second by Ms. Anderson. Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. We need to go all the way to number 9. Greg Whitten.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, we have a customer who has been billed for a number of years as being connected to our system. So they were billed both the wastewater base charge and wastewater volumetric charge when they were not connected to the system. They are on the water system. In 2005 or approximately thereafter, that's when their account was coded as being connected. When they were not connected to the system in 2009, when the board met to reconsider a policy that preceded the OUA called forced billing, where when gravity sewer was put into a residential neighborhood and if somebody elected not to connect, they were force billed both for the base charge and the volumetric charge on wastewater. In 2009, the board changed the policy to reflect only billing for base billing. So OUA staff went through and looked at the potential number of customers. I think it was about 125 that stopped being billed for the volumetric charge on wastewater and received 3 months of credit, which was allowed by another OUA policy for the adjustment of previous bills.
So Mr. Whitten's been charged since 9/11 of '03.
No, sir, he was charged before that, but that's where our records go back, our electronic records go back to September of '03, where we could ascertain what was attached to his bill.
Okay, so he's been charged both charges, we know, since 9/11/03. That's basically what we're saying.
So what staff had done when Greg came in and made us aware of this default with the billing, we automatically credited his account. Well, we stopped the billing for the volumetric charge and gave him 3 months of credit right off the top. We went back and looked and calculated what the charges were back to the time the board made a policy decision to stop charging the volumetric charge, and calculated his refund to be $1,139.97. When I presented this data to Mr. Whitten, Greg stated that he felt, well, he can state what he feels about what the policy is, but he wanted credit back to where our records reflected, which were, as we know, September of 2003.
I'll let the record show that Mr. Cooper arrived 8:35 and will be now our voting member.
So that's kind of where we're at. Mr. Whitten's here to speak to the board or answer any questions they might have. The question is, if we were to follow the change of policy in September of '09, Mr. Whitten is still due the $1,139.97. If we go back to '03, which we can do, then the question is, do we also need to address that with the other 125 cases? If it's going to be a change of policy or if this is a one-time event. So I'll leave it to the board if they've got any questions.
So that was 145, you said, that what we did?
125 that we adjusted or quit billing, what they call the forced billing, which was both the volumetric and the base charge for sewer. We only charge now the base charge.
And we did that in '09?
In '09, staff corrected the policy, gave everybody their 3 months of credit back to July of '09, and quit billing them the volumetric charge. Mr. Whitten's account, since it was coded as being connected when he wasn't.
So it just fell through the cracks?
Yes, sir. And that's why I felt that it was reasonable to give him that credit back to July '09. And again, he can state what he's here for, but it's been the belief that we ought to at least go back to '03 where our records reflect and credit him.
Okay, so if we go back to '03, total credit would be $37.76? 26.36.
No, it'll be the combination of the two. 3,700 and.
Okay, so the total that we would owe them would be $3,776.45?
Yes, sir. That's the combination of the two.
John, let me ask you something. If I remember right, and some other discussions that we've had, the policy of charging both the volumetric and the base facility charge was a city policy that the OUA inherited. Is that correct?
That is correct, ma'am. That's why I said, yeah, it was preceded the OUA. It was a carryover of the city policy.
Okay.
So there's, I mean, it's not that policy was incorrect. You used the word corrected that policy. We changed the policy, didn't we? I mean, it's not that there was anything incorrect about that. It was just policy.
I stand corrected on that use of that word.
Thank
Yes,
you, because that really changes everything. I mean,
well, I don't mean to imply, and again, as I shared before, it's not that our policy was incorrect. It was a changed policy. That would be a better use of language, that we changed our policy to reflect only billing for the base charge and not base charge and volumetric.
but if we refund this gentleman's fees back to 2003, then we owe that for how many other people? How many other accounts?
At a minimum, it would be another 125. We'd have to go back and
Somewhere
try.
at $2,000, $2,500 apiece on those two?
It's all based on what their volumetric use. And
Right.
if they had 2 people in the house versus 5 or 6, it would be a different number.
But if we go back to the 09, we don't owe anybody anything with Mr. Wood,
Right,
right?
that corrects his account as to when we changed our policy at that point and treats him the same as we treated everyone else.
Greg, you want to speak, or?
Yes, sir. I'm Greg Whitten for y'all that don't know me. This policy was forced on the public and it caused hardship for a lot of people back in times, back from 91 to now. I don't have anything from 91 to the 03, but I feel that that is incorrect to charge somebody for something that you're not using. And if the rest of the public didn't check back on it like I did, then that's, their hardship that they got to deal with. I only find it right, that's mine. I paid it, I don't have it, and the Okeechobee Utility Authority does. I feel that with the interest on the money, it's going to be a little more than what y'all say. I mean, I didn't ask for all the way back to 1991 because I don't have that in black and white. I do have that amount of there that you can see some further.
Anybody have any questions for Mr. Wood?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
No, it's just, it was really not a correction. What it was, we just changed the policy.
Right.
And so we didn't do anything to, I think we were being generous when we changed it. I mean, we could have dropped some of those charges or changed them around, but I don't think that the OUA was in error by charging that, because, they use people that come in and tell them what the rates should be, and consultants, and that's what it established it. And then, when we changed it, it was a benefit to the customers that were being charged that.
That we're using?
Yeah, and so like I said, I don't look at it as a correction. I think it's a change. I really don't see an issue with 125 people. And unfortunately, Greg was the only one that was overlooked. So to follow board policy can be, fair. I think that he is due back till the date that we changed it, which is $1,139, and we never had addressed any issues with how the policy was established prior to that. But then when we did, they were refunded the money, and I think that he's entitled to that $1,139.97 back to change the policy.
Basil, has there been any calculation on that $1,139.97, what kind of loss Mr. Whitten has incurred as far as interest, if he had that money? I mean, because I know if somebody don't pay their bills or something, everybody's going to charge them interest. So, I think a happy medium may be here. We ought to consider, the interest as well. We benefited off that $1,139.97 for the last 2 years and a half. That should have been in his pocket. He could have invested it, done whatever he wanted to with it.
You got any thoughts?
Well, I sympathize with Mr. Whitten, but the policy is pretty cut and dried back to 09, and I think that's our guidance, and that's what we have to go with.
No, I agree with what Tommy was saying, I feel the same way. Because it wasn't something that, it was something that we inherited, it wasn't something that we established. And the board, is my recollection when we went through this, is that it really wasn't fair to the customers. And that was the reason that we changed the policy.
Well, it wasn't so much, it wasn't fair, I believe it was, if they weren't hooked to sewer,
They didn't use the word.
right,
Right.
and we just, in the way they calculated, but they still paid the water charge and things
Right.
like that.
Well, they pay a base charge, is that right?
Yes.
That is correct.
Yeah, you still pay that base charge and.
It's the
then-
volume charge that
Right.
we look at.
And that was the issue and the difference between what it would have been and that base charge, you know, that credit that was taken off or given back. It was basically a policy change. And like I said, it wasn't a correction, it was just something that this board felt sympathetic to those customers to kind of wash that away, you know, get rid of it. And although I don't blame Greg for asking, I think that we did do those people a service when we changed that. We were looking out for their best interest.
Maybe you got some interest numbers?
If you would, what we benefited as far as interest, since we probably get on the average a 0.5%, and that would probably been appropriate from 2009, that would probably add like $10 to what Mr. Whitney would have gotten as far as interest. Make an assumption here, but what we benefited would probably be $10.
What would be your best assumption of what he would have benefited if he'd have had it in a public account?
Double that,
Double.
say $20.
Greg, can you speak again?
Yes, sir. Y'all keep on talking about it and inherited it. I didn't want to inherit any of this. This money, you didn't take a product that you're charging me for once again. And I'm going back to that. How can you say that this is right in America? Let's listen to Okeechobee, where everybody knows everybody, to say, hey, we're going to take this money and you're not getting nothing. I don't pay my bill. My youngins don't drink any water. That's how the OUA works. I've been here going on 20 years. It's simple. Mr. Hoover there says that he don't think we should go back any further. Well, if the public didn't want to come here and fight for their money, like I said, once again, I didn't ask for all of it. If you asked for all of it, it would be a lot.
I don't mean to be argumentative, Greg, but you know, when they did this, they hire rate consultants, you know, they set the rates and everything, and it's the same thing as these customers that just have a water meter out there and they don't use any water, but they still have to pay that base charge. And that's what the principle was all set up on, was the sewer connection and the water charges. And when this was changed, it was to eliminate anything of that nature. And for the sewer, the people that didn't use the sewer part. And I've talked, you know, I've thought about it, because I got several properties that I pay on whether people live there or not, and I feel the same way a lot of times, you know, like, dang, why do I gotta pay that when one of my tenants moves out or something? But it's the same principle, and that's the way it's set up. And I don't think, like I said, it wasn't an error, it wasn't anything to be malicious to the customers when they set that up. That's just how they set it up. And then when we did realize that, you know, well, that's probably not necessary to charge that volumetric portion of that bill, we went in and changed it. And I'm not saying that, you know, it's doing you a favor or anything, but as far as policy goes, and that's what we've established, is we would go back. We don't have to. We could be sitting here talking about giving you those actually for 3 months or whatever, and that would be about it. But I think that, you know, in all fairness, you know, we should go back to 3 years, since you were one of the ones that was missed in there, is what I'm saying. There's no maliciousness there or anything, you know, for bad feelings, but prior to '09, that's what they did, you know. And right or wrong in your mind, that was the way it operated. That's how they set their rates, that's how they established their, you know, budgets, and everything was based on charges that they made. And I somewhat agree with you. It might not have been fair to you as one of these persons, but when it was just, you know, brought up, we did change it and corrected it, and we adjust our rates accordingly now, you know, and so that's why I said there's no maliciousness, there's no, you know, ill feelings towards you at all. I can understand your plight, but like I said, I think that, you know, as far as this board can go, unless you want to choose some other option, as far as this board can go with this issue is back to 09 when we did change the policy to your favor, you know. And I know that's hard to swallow or hard to understand, and if I was in your shoes, I'd probably be saying the same thing. But 09 is, you know, basically when we corrected it, or that's the wrong word, changed the policy, and
So basically, city council did all
yeah,
this.
well, no, it was the way the city did it when they came over here, Mr. Fortner, and when they set all that up, that's what they established it. So then, when it was brought to our attention, like I said, in 09, I mean, it was a no-brainer, we changed it. I mean, it was done. I mean, I voted for it, I said, heck yeah, that's not right. But that's the way they had done it for years before that. And like I said, technically, we could argue that we don't owe you anything, but I think you're entitled to it back to when we changed it. I really do, and that's why I said, and if you want to hypothetically throw in an interest rate there, or make that a good round number, $1,150 or something, would include any potential interest that you would earn, which I don't think that's a concern of ours either, because we don't know about your personal finances, but I think that's more than we can do with the policy that we have established on this board right now. And like I said, Greg, I understand your frustration and aggravation. I go through it every month. I mean, when somebody moves out, I still get a water bill every month, and that meter sits out there. And you know, some place I got, I can't even hook the sewer, but there's no sewer there, but I pay it. You know, and so.
What is, this you're talking about is a water basic water bill, that's $24 a month.
No, I'm talking about the base charge and the sewer charge, and that's the difference.
Base, I'm not talking about
the
the base.
volumetric charge.
I'm talking about what I paid
Right,
for
and
you
that's
did
what I'm
instead.
saying, and that's the way they established it, that's the way they set their rates up years ago, that's how they based their budget on, you know, historically based their budget on these revenues that they were gonna generate. Now, call it greed, call it oversight, and back then, I don't know what it is, but I think that, you know, somebody may not be as sympathetic, but I think we owe you back to 09 for sure, and then, you know, but we can't, I don't see how we can do anything past 09, because that's when we changed the policy.
You got it in front of you, right there in black and white.
Yeah.
What you say, they, Okeechobee Utility Authority was done since they done this.
Yeah, but they set all those charges and fees and based their budgets and lived by that volumetric charge all the way up until it became an issue and we did change it. That's what I'm
There
saying.
was nothing really wrong or illegal with that policy.
Right.
We just decided that we didn't need to be charging that, and so we changed the policy.
Right.
So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but we had every right to charge a volumetric charge because sewer was available, and the law says that you'll hook up sewer when it's available. So even though you haven't hooked up, we're charging you as if you had.
Okay, so this law, this coming a certified letter, I take it, that you must do this. Because if you get something to do with a law, it comes certified mail, or, you know, a deputy brings it to your house, a subpoena, whatever, it comes certified mail. Can you show me one of those letters?
The way the statute reads, you have to be notified. You can receive a registered or a certified letter, or it can be done by first-class mail, or, you know, there's other avenues open. Now, in 91, I don't know what the law was. I'm just saying under today's law, it can be by registered or certified letter, or it can be by first-class mail. There's any number of ways that you as the public, anybody in the public, could be notified.
Going back to you there, you known about this since 2000.
We've had multiple discussions about that, yes, since I started here in 2000.
Why wasn't the board addressed on that then? I mean, what brought up this on September of '09? How come all of a sudden?
Well, there was a change in policy that adjusted that billing, from going from base charge and volumetric to base charge only. It was addressed in 2009. Again, the idea whether you and I had a discussion about this in 2000 or 2001, wherever we had our discussions, the policy was established by the city, which was a carryover to the OUA. It was a policy. It wasn't until 2009 that it was brought up and that the policy was changed.
Now, the 125 people that we're talking about, they were getting both charges too, like Greg got.
That is correct, sir.
And then in '09, we basically, whenever you made this change, I don't know what date that was, what was it?
I believe it was in September of '09 where the policy was changed.
And then you went back 3 months.
That's correct. So we went back to the September, August, and the July billing.
So,
We've been charging him in error since then.
No, y'all been charging me ever since '91.
I know, but.
Well, wait a minute, 91, when we didn't exist.
93.
Yeah.
Be careful now.
93.
But that was buried in those papers when we signed, we were created, that we assumed.
The war was going on between the
Greg,
city
I
and the county,
understand
and
this,
this wasn't an
I
act
understand
until
you're upset,
95.
but it's a hard pill to swallow. And if it was up to me, I'd cut you a check, and I had no problem with it, but sitting on this board and doing what's right, I think that we have to go back to '09 and put you some interest in there and clear it up there.
No, sir, y'all let that match, let you deal with it. Not here.
Okay. Thank you, Greg, I appreciate it. I think we have to wait until, Don, what do we do?
Well, I think the appropriate thing to do is to go and take the adjustment. I think that would be fair to do.
Yeah, I think that's.
You don't really have an option there. I've thought about this since I was aware of it. I don't see how we can go back beyond '09 to change that. And should it become challenged by any other, we'd address it then, but take, for the record, that's all we can do is go back.
Well, that
to
doesn't, I mean, that takes us back and cleans it up exactly like
All the other
all the other
Yeah,
accounts,
yeah,
right?
Yes, sir.
And that was,
And
I feel for him, I do,
But everybody's whole in '09 except Greg.
Greg.
And everybody was made right in '09.
Okay,
This
so
is
do
the
we,
only one that slipped through the cracks.
do we need a motion?
Yes.
I make a motion that we refund him the $1,139.97 as outlined by the policy change. That $1,139.97 includes $20.03 interest for a total of $1,160 even.
I have a motion by Mr. Huckabee.
May I ask one issue? If I may, you talked about a refund. Could that be modified to reflect a credit to his account as opposed to going through the process? That's probably smart.
I just
Credit the account.
I would prefer to cut him a check.
Okay, I just throw that out as an option.
Okay, need a second?
I'll second.
Second by Melanie Anderson. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. Item number 10, property and casualty insurance. Lon Bryant of LB Bryant and Company.
Mr. Chairman and Board, we have Lon Bryant here to give us an update on the upcoming renewals of our property and casualty and our workers' compensation package of insurance. Take the days off.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I appreciate the opportunity to come here today. As some of you may know, I've been here from time to time over the past several years to bring the board up to date on what's happening with the insurance marketplace, how it affects you, just because we believe in a proactive arrangement with our clients, kind of let them know the good news and the bad news. And fortunately, you've been the recipient of some very good news over the past several years with your premium structure in the form of rate guarantees, rate reductions. And so we thought we'd come before you today and kind of bring you up to date on what's happening in the overall marketplace and how that might impact OUA. So I'd like to start, if I could, by kind of reviewing with you your insurance company generally and what kind of program they have. PGIT, as we call it, is a long-standing governmental insurance trust. As you may know, there's only a handful of people in the state of Florida that entertain risks such as yours and municipalities in general because of the unique nature of the entity. They have unique exposures. They are subjected to different forms of law in some cases for lawsuits and so forth. So it's a unique market, and PGIT has been the leader in that market for over 15 years, 13 years. They have currently 700 members in the state of Florida, making them one of the largest funds in the state. They're very strong financially. They have right now no debt. They are a debt-free balance sheet. They have $100 million of cash and investments. And the reason that's important, it sounds like they're just a big cash cow, but in reality, as you know, with the hurricane threat here, they retain a lot of that risk so that they can set their reinsurance points higher, which ultimately results in lower premium costs. So the stronger they are, the more benefit it is to the policyholders. So they're in very good financial strength. They have 24-hour claims access. They are, and this is a really important point, they are a nonprofit organization. So they're not taking 30% and sweeping it to the bottom line. They return the money in the form of cost and premiums to their policy members. Policy members are board members and operating committee members at PGIT. So they sit in and review the balance sheets and look over the entire operation, just like this board does for OUA. Their coverages, one of the unique things about preferred governmental is that they do have their own form of coverage. It's a carefully crafted form, very broad, specifically designed for municipalities. Some of the things that they provide that standard insurance policies do not offer are coverage for things like injunctive relief claims, EEOC claims, sunshine violations, petition recalls, public records law, inverse condemnation allegations. Those are pretty hard to come by in an insurance policy, and if you could, you probably wouldn't pay for them. So they've done very well with that. They also offer an audit-free policy, so when you get your quote from PGIT, that's what you pay. The only exception to that is workers' comp, because workers' comp is adjusted on the payroll. So the package policy, though, when we quote a price, that is the price. There's no adjustments at the end of the year for big run-ups because you had a higher payroll, you had bought more vehicles, whatever the case may be. It's a non-auditable arrangement. The other nice feature that's benefited OUA already is free property appraisal service. As you know, it's not so much a concern these days, but when the prices of real estate were running through the roof, it was hard to keep up with valuations and to know whether you had appropriate insurance amounts. PGIT was one of the first companies to make arrangements with a qualified appraisal firm to provide that service at no cost, and OUA took advantage of that and had their facilities appraised. And they are now in an update service mode, which is a free thing with appraisal service. That's sort of a quick overview of PGIT. I'd like to talk a little bit now briefly about the marketplace. I have on the third page of this exhibit a little printout from the web, and I highlighted the date because this is dated yesterday, July 2nd. Nothing more important than timely information. And this is from the Property and Casualty 360 website. Now, I realize nobody here is familiar with that website, but it is an inside industry leading publication and website that professionals in the industry take a look at from time to time. And they're kind of commenting in this article on the state of the marketplace, and they cite in this exhibit, and there's many, if you Google this, there's many, many, many exhibits. I just wanted to give you a slice. Wells Fargo, I use this because everybody knows who Wells Fargo is. Wells Fargo is a nationwide bank. You know, Wells Fargo is a nationwide insurance operation with offices maybe even in Okeechobee, but they operate everywhere. And basically what they're citing in this exhibit is a hardening commercial insurance marketplace and price increases. In the last paragraph, it says, Wells Fargo has consistently seen increases of 10 to 15% for the majority of our clients across the country. While rate reductions are occurring, they are typically the result of program restructuring or introduction of new capacity. And what they're saying there is that's the average, 10 to 15%. And predominantly what's driving that is a tightening property market. Now, unfortunately in Florida, fortunately, we've been the recipient of some pretty good weather here. But as you know from just reading the headlines this week, there are significant world events weather-wise that contribute to high loss ratios and tightening reinsurance markets. And this past year has been no exception. And so we are seeing, and everybody is seeing, some tightening in the property marketplace. And you may recall that Florida changed the statutes a year ago where public entities no longer have the level of immunity they had before that. They've doubled, in fact, the amount of exposure that you folks have for lawsuits we call it the lawyer refreshment law, basically to afford more litigation, if you will, without having to go get a claim relief bill before the legislature. Good or bad, it is a law, and the activity has increased. Fortunately, OUA has not been subject to much activity in that area. But as this law evolves and the public becomes more familiar with it, we do expect to have a higher level of litigation and probably higher payouts resulting in more claims. So those combined efforts all are contributing currently to a little bit of a tightening in the insurance market. So I wanted to make you aware of that in case you hadn't seen that in your own businesses yet and you hadn't renewed yet. Most likely you will see some adjustment in your pricing. Now, I think it's appropriate, given that set of information, to kind of review what has been the case with your current property and casualty insurer historically. So you might gauge how they've behaved. We have went back and looked to 2009, which we thought is relevant because that's, last 3 years. And I want to point out that if you start at the spreadsheet, it's the last exhibit. We've kind of laid out for you the pricing for all of the property and casualty coverages for 09, 10-1-10, 10-1-11. And what's important about this is when we came to you in 2008 in this boardroom and suggested that PGIT was willing to offer a 2-year rate guarantee, a lot of people didn't believe that because nobody was doing it. They were one of the few companies that were willing to offer that. And as you can see, not only did they offer a 2-year rate guarantee, they actually did exactly that, but more importantly, they took their workers' compensation arrangement and the price actually got lowered from $61,000 in the first year to $55,000 in the second year. So your cost actually went down. Overall, you saved a little under 2%, but 9%, almost 10% on your workers' compensation costs. So then when the rate guarantee for the 2-year deal comes up, everybody's expecting the whole thing to come undone, right? Well, that's actually not the case. The property premium went up, but I didn't want to just create a lot of information here that you couldn't absorb. The reason the property price went up is not because we changed the rates, it's because OUA put a new plan online. It was a $3 million increase in the property values. So what happened there was that's a direct result of that coming on, so we had more values at risk. But the price did not, the unit rate did not change. All of the other prices went down, and including the workers' compensation had a dramatic drop from $55,000 to $46,000. So as you can see, historically over the last 3 years, the prices have been $324,000, $318,000, $314,000. The average price at the end has been about $319,000. When we look at that picture compared with the rest of the marketplace, we generally see a wave like this. Carriers tend to have knee-jerk reactions. When things are going really good, they chop the prices low, low, low. The only problem with that is when things tighten up like they are now, we're in here saying we need a 100% rate increase, and you're throwing me out the door and saying, wow, that's crazy. So what PGIT's approach is to take a more level approach and a balanced approach and a partnership approach. They give you a 2-year rate guarantee when nobody else is doing it. They come in and hold the prices stable and even lower the prices after that because they could. This year, though, we want to tell you that we think that probably what's going to happen is you're going to get a rate increase. But what we're here to say is it's not going to be anything ridiculous. It's going to be completely in line with the marketplace and what everybody else is experiencing out there. It's not going to be a knee-jerk reaction, and you're going to be well in line. And if you go back and look at your historical pricing, it's really going to be averaged out a pretty good deal. And we are hopeful that as time presses on and we get through another hurricane season, knock on wood, that perhaps we'll be in a position to come back to a 2-year arrangement for you. And because they like it, we like it, and our customers like it. And they certainly are well aware of that at PGIT and have been trying to get back to that position, and we think they will at some point. Now, what are we going to do to control the premium costs going forward? Well, we have a couple things. Loss control meetings have already been held by PGIT risk management claim staff with your management. They've had 2 meetings so far with Janet McKinley on the workers' comp. Workers' compensation right now at OUA is the leading loss cause issue. And what's causing it is back strains. We've had a number of back strains, and some of those have resulted in growing loss ratios. Now, we think that's very correct. So they've had 2 meetings with staff. They are going to be setting up a senior supervisor meeting with the risk control officer at PGIT to train them on how to set up a safety program to mitigate back strains, so that it will go down the line to employees, so employees will be advised of when to lift things, when not to lift things, when to use mechanical assisted devices to lift things to try to bring the loss ratio down, which will in fact help the overall work comp loss ratio. That's a major cost driver. Alternative coverage and deductible options will obviously need to be explored, and that's our job. Right now, OUA carries approximately $1 million of liability across the board with various deductibles. Public officials liability, you carry $4 million of coverage along with employment practices. That's a very, very highly litigated area right now across the country. OUA has had some brush with that. But I'm not certain that $4 million is maybe in this market the limit that's that important, but that's an option that we will be providing to you to consider, and so you can measure the cost savings and see if it has validity for you. So we're going to look at those kind of things, maybe a little bit higher property deductible for a year, just to give you the flexibility that you might need. And then finally, alternative market quotations where it makes sense. We believe there are some coverages that we can maybe shop aggressively and see if we can carve those out and put those on a standalone basis and then reduce cost savings. We intend to do that and bring those back to you for your review. Sometime, it probably looks like it's going to be in August, maybe a little sooner, but I think about mid-August is when we should have the entire thing done for you. But in essence, that's where we are, that's where Pidgeot is, PGIT, that's where the overall insurance market is, and we think you're in a good place. We think you'll be in line with everybody, and we hope for no catastrophes. Any questions?
You said that, and I'm relatively new, more than here, a little over a year, that our exposure doubled. What is it now on that law that changed?
Well, the tort cap in Florida, tort cap is the ability to sue.
Right.
Under state law. And essentially, it was 100, 200. And what happens is if OUA got sued under Florida tort law, and there was $1 million verdict prior to October 1 of last year, the most that they would pay anyone claiming was $100,000. Now, if it was an aggravated type of injury, the lawyer may well file a claim relief bill with the legislature in Tallahassee, which is the device used to get rewards higher than the tort cap. And if you look at the history of claim relief bills in Florida, it's a mixed bag. We generally have the legislature approve some, but the vast majority of them are not approved. Where they seem to approve most of them are where there is heinous, onerous conditions where the municipality could have, should have done better, known better, and just didn't. Is essentially what we see. And the other thing that's helped is the legislature, because they approved the budget, is well aware of the tight finances around the state of Florida, and when they approve a claim relief bill, it ultimately impacts everybody, and so they're reticent to, willy-nilly just say okay. So that's helped. But now that they doubled, the tort cap. And you would, most people would think, wow, in this economy, they doubled the tort cap. That's amazing. So they've essentially taken it up from that level to double. And that became effective last October 1. And so, we are in the city, we do some city governments as well, and we are seeing a high frequency of letters come in from the plaintiff's lawyers, mainly for simple things like sidewalk, pipes sticking up, and things like that. We see a lot of those where, hurt my knee, no witnesses, and we see a lot of that. And so where that ends up, only time will tell, because these claims all take time to play out. As you know, in Florida, if we threaten to sue you today, we have to wait 6 months before we can. So it all has to go through that process.
Anyone else?
No, that's pretty consistent.
Good.
What drove that work comp more than anything was probably our payroll went down.
Yeah, payroll did go down, no doubt about it. The modification, though, also went down. It improved from, it's been dropping about 2 points a year, but we do think it's about to go back up again because of the growing reserves for the strain injuries we talked about in this presentation. We're starting to see the loss ratios for 9 and 10 starting to come up a little bit. Yeah.
Where you projecting?
Well, I think it's going to be like a 0.91.
Oh, still.
0.91. It's still below 1, yeah. So you still get credit. Yes, sir. Which is good.
Yeah.
No doubt.
But we're moving forward with our safety program.
Definitely are. So we appreciate it, and I hope everybody has a great 4th.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Are they gonna offer that 2-year rate guarantee again, or what?
Well, I don't think it's going to be this year, and the reason is it really wouldn't be of any help to you because they'd rather do it in a stable market or a declining market. When the prices are going up like that, you don't want to get locked into a 2-year deal. Yeah, we'd rather, if the market comes down, we'd rather be able to give you the savings rather
If
than.
we have horrendous losses, we'd rather have a.
Well, fortunately, knock on wood, fortunately, that hadn't been the case, so that's a good thing.
Okay, moving on to item number 11.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I'd like to introduce Murray Hamilton of Public Resources Management Group. He is the analyst there and the producer of this report. It's very comprehensive, and some of you have been through the prior update back in September, in the summer of 2010. This is going to be much the same with now updated information as of about a week ago.
Thank you, Basil. Good morning. As Basil was saying, my name is Murray Hamilton. I work for Public Resources Management Group. We're a utility rate and financial consulting firm based out of Maitland, Florida. The project manager on this engagement is Henry Thomas, which I think most of you are familiar with. Henry is our vice president of our company. He has over 30 years experience in the utility industry. He couldn't be with us today, so I'm here. But I've worked with Henry specifically with the utility authority here for the last 8 years. And periodically we're asked to update and review the financial forecast. We get questions on different rate structures and rate development. You may recall a few years ago, we went in and we analyzed the level of your capital connection charges, which is based specifically on your investment in your facilities. So we have an extensive history with the authority here. Today, the purpose of our meeting is to review the recent financial forecast and compare a number of scenarios that we brought to you. As Basil pointed out, last week we were here and we ran through a number of different scenarios with staff. As John and I have talked about this, we really, in terms of when we get into the details of scenario 1 versus scenario 2, we really have 2 separate bookends of extremes. When we talk about the flexibility that we think that you have in terms of, obviously, I think you're aware, we have some cash reserves that have accumulated over time based on policies adopted by this board. And what we're trying to do is look at a number of scenarios where we can phase in future rates, because today the revenues are not going to be adequate in the future to meet the rising costs of the utility system. And so we're trying to look at scenarios where we can take advantage of prior period revenues, or the reserve balances that we've accumulated to date, and help phase in those higher costs over time. Three specific areas of measurement when we talk about the scenarios is creating an atmosphere where the utility system is going to have a positive cash flow, where we're meeting our minimum coverage requirements. And when I talk about debt service coverage, it's basically the amount of revenues that is left over after we pay our operating expenses. So it's before any capital replacement, it's obviously before any debt service payments or any other system needs that might exist. And then lastly, we look at meeting the cash reserve policies that have been identified by the board. We've got a 30-day minimum emergency reserve fund. We've got a 90-day operating reserve fund as well. We have the ability to fund a rate stabilization fund, which we currently have a balance. That's one of the resources that we're going to look at in terms of phasing in higher costs over time. I'd like to point out that each of the three scenarios that we talked about today meet those three criteria. So personally, I don't necessarily have a vested interest in one scenario over the other, as well as we may talk about other scenarios that this board might like to consider. We've offered to John and Basil where if you choose to do so, Henry and I can come back and we can hold a more thorough workshop to analyze or vet any one of these scenarios or any other discussions you'd like to have. The differences in the scenarios is the price to the customer, and that's where I think we want to pay some consideration. In the back of the briefing document, we have a rate comparison where the authorities, basically the residential rate at 6,000 monthly gallons, which is currently about $112 per month, how that compares with other utilities around the state. In this particular comparison, it's the highest. So I'll tell you that up front. When we talk about the scenarios here, some of the scenarios have a greater impact in terms of rates over time, and particularly one of them, as Basil points out, we have a good, a better, and a best approach. There may be some scenarios in the middle that we can talk about as well, as different ideas may come up.
Let me interrupt you.
Yes, sir.
When you say ours is the highest, just to clarify that, so some people may not misconstrue that, it's like, we have the highest water rates in South Florida. There's fees that are tied to other municipality utilities that we have because we are our own utility and we sell our own water. We don't buy or have fees that we pay to service this particular area.
Right. There are outside city surcharges.
Right, surcharges. So that everybody understands
yes.
When you made that statement, and because people do have an issue with that, so you can go on. But if you take that number or that figure and put it back into some of these other cities or municipalities, their rates will be as much as ours or more. So
right.
And that needs to be clarified, because some people always say that the rates no joke are higher than anywhere in South Florida, but that's not always.
There's obviously a lot of items that go into the rate structure.
Right.
The age of the system, the investment of the system, the mix, how spread out the community might be in terms of, are our customers centrally located where we have less infrastructure that we need to focus in on. So those are very good points. And again, when we do look at the rate comparison, we'll look at it later. It's a benchmark. It's one of many benchmarks. We're going to talk about some different tools that the bond market looks at in terms of your cash reserve policies and those kinds of things. That's where some of that information came from. Some of the major issues utilities facing today is that the current revenues of the system are not adequate to meet the existing expenditure requirements. Now, that's your operating expenses, that's your annual debt service payments, both the principal and the interest. It's your capital, your reoccurring capital needs that are funded from rates. Okay, that's what goes into your gross revenue requirements of the system. And although our budget for FY13 is balanced, it's balanced because we're utilizing reserves in order to do that. Now, I do want to point out to you, Henry and I have been updating this financial forecast plan for probably about 6 to 8 years, roughly. We're not in a position where we're outside of the plan. We had expected to use a portion of reserves to cover those deficiencies at this point in the study plan. Particularly when the wastewater plant was expanded, we knew we had reserves that would be available in the form of capital connection charges. We put policies in place where we could fund a rate stabilization fund, and y'all have done those things over time. And the initial plan was to use those reserves to phase in these higher costs while new growth continued to connect to the system. And obviously, as everybody's aware in this room, economic times have changed. The connections didn't materialize as it was expected. However, we do still have those components that are still in place. We're still collecting revenues from the 1020 customers, from most of the 1020 customers, so we have those revenues coming in. We funded a rate stabilization fund that's going to help us to mitigate some of those deficiencies. But over time, over the next 5 years, our existing customer rates are going to have to increase over time to meet the level of our expenditure needs. Right now, our utility system is what I would call underutilized. When Henry and I went, we looked at your capital connection charges and the facilities that we have in place. Generally, and it may have changed a little bit, but we had anywhere between 65 to 70% of our water and wastewater treatment capacity available to serve future growth. Now, what that does for us today is it puts us in a position where we have a higher fixed cost per current customer, if you will. So, for example, if I went and I looked at the water system, the average cost on the water system might be $9 per 1,000 gallons sold. Well, obviously, as we connect new customers to the system, that $9 cost is going to decrease over time, because most of the costs associated with both water and wastewater production are fixed in the short term. That's all of your labor and personnel costs, your debt service on the system, maintaining your capital. All those items are fixed in the short term. Your only true variable costs are your cost of utilities and chemicals and those kinds of things. So again, as we expand the system over time, the customer will see a direct benefit in that, as those higher costs today will decline over time. In the short term, though, future growth is expected to be minimal. Okay, maybe 25 connections per year on the water system. Cumulatively, over the next 5 years, we might see an increase in revenue of $65,000 in total over 5 years from growth. This excludes the Treasure Island development, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But right now, we're expecting revenues to be flat. And capital expenditures. We have $92 million invested in infrastructure within the utility system, of which about $24 million has been depreciated. We really need to fund those reoccurring capital items, the renewals and the replacements of those lines and water tanks and collection systems through user rates over time. Excluding Treasure Island, we still have about $12 million in improvements that need to be made over the next 5 years, most of which are going to come from user rates, about $1.6 million per year, or about 17% of your revenues. It's been about 2 years since we formally updated this study. I will say Basil and John called Henry and I last year to see if it would be a good time to update the financial forecast based on where the budget was and, year-to-date results. And we thought that the utility was still on plan and that there wasn't a need for an update. The next few slides really talks about our planning process. And there are a number of tasks, there are a number of areas that we often hit on. We didn't necessarily hit every task in this particular update of the financial forecast, which begins with the budget process, looking at policies and procedures of the board, focusing on quality and reliability of utility service, looking at the adequacy of our user rates to meet the cash flow needs of the system, and identifying the appropriate levels of the reserves to address the unforeseen changes in the system, and also to maintain your credit worthiness with lenders. On the capital improvements program, and I've already mentioned this in some part, having $92 million invested in infrastructure, of which a good comparison of that, we've got about 42 or $45 million, I think, in outstanding debt service associated with that investment. Roughly 26% of those assets have been depreciated, will need to be renewed in the future. Our utility plan looks at the age of the system, the level of service that we want to provide over time, particularly looking at balancing the liquidity needs and the ability to maintain a sound position while ensuring reliable water and wastewater service. When we look at setting utility rates, or more specifically looking at the adequacy of our rates, we're looking at cash flow. Okay, depreciation is an accrual-based number. We're trying to target what we're actually going to fund from user rates to pay for reoccurring needs as they're needing to occur. And we do that in the form of a capital improvements program, which is part of the budget process. And so we look at setting those rates based on the cash flow needs of the system. Particularly when we talk about liquidity and those kinds of things, and this gets to some of our scenarios that we're going to talk about, debt service can be a significant portion of that. Today, our average cost per account is about $242 per year in annual debt service payments. So that's principal and interest. So $20 a month for the average account that's out there is going towards debt service on the system. Cash reserve policies. Fitch Ratings has a publication out there on bond rating criteria. The two top areas of concern are cash reserve balances and debt service coverage targets. Cash reserve indicating financial strength. As an example, a strong utility system might have 1 year's worth of operating reserve. What Fitch terms as a mid-range financial strength would be about 180 days of operating reserves, and a weaker position would be 90 days or less, which is about 3 months of your operating expenses. This kind of gives some of the background. I'm not sure of those who were here when the current cash reserve policies were put into place, but these were some of the issues, some of the concerns surrounding that. Based on your emergency reserve fund and your operating contingency reserve fund, if you will, this board targets about 120 days in terms of cash reserve. So we're in the mid-range. We're not trying to have the strongest position. We certainly don't want the weakest position, but we're striving for a mid-range target. In addition to that, we're shooting for a debt service coverage. Again, this is the margin of our revenues after paying expenses that's available to pay our annual debt service payments. We're looking for something around a 150, meaning for every dollar of annual debt service payments, we're going to collect $1.50, if you will. And again, that meets the mid-range target. Some other areas that are looked for in terms of bond rating are the management style, how active the boards are in making decisions and doing forward-looking planning like we're doing here today. The affordability of rates. one of the reasons I brought up the rate comparison earlier. Customer growth in the system, how much capacity you have available for future growth, and of course, regulatory compliance. Promoting water conservation in this particular time of economic slowdown, revenue stability. Now, Henry and I didn't necessarily address these issues in the current study, but several years ago, we addressed the issue of revenue stability by looking at your monthly base facility charges, if you will, your minimum charges, trying to make sure that we could put, to the extent practicable, the amount of fixed costs associated with utility systems in those minimum customer charges to provide some stability. That way, as people change their water use habits, there's less risk, if you will, to have your revenues decline over time. And additionally, this board has adopted a capacity reservation policy, if you will, that once water and wastewater service is available, that those customers along that same line start contributing to the fixed costs of the system. We were having some discussions about that earlier today of why those customers are required to pay the minimum charge, if you will, again, to offset those fixed operating costs of the water and wastewater plants that have been put in place to serve those customers. Okay, on to our current tasks. Basically, we looked at updating your financial forecast from fiscal year 2012, so year to date, through fiscal year 17. It also conforms with your capital improvements program. So we haven't looked beyond FY17, particularly because we don't have those capital projects and needs that go beyond that forecast period. We're looking at a funding strategy to pay for your operations, your capital replacements, and your debt service. We're looking at testing your compliance with certain lender requirements. You have both senior lien debt as well as junior lien. Senior lien being your current bank notes with BB&T. Your junior lien debts being your SRF loans. They have different standards that must be met. We're looking at the need to raise rates over the future years. Without the reserves that we have in place today, we would actually have to raise rates next year. But because we have capital connection charges on hand, and we have the rate stabilization fund, as well as other reserves in the operating account, we're going to be able to either delay or offset or put off some of those increases over time. This is our cost recovery formula. And for the most part, you can pull these numbers right out of the budget. Operating and maintenance expenses for the upcoming year are $6.2 million. It's 53% of your gross requirements of the system. Annual debt service payments, which again is both principal and interest payments of the system, $3.3 million currently, or 28% of your gross needs of the system. Capital funded from rates. Now in the current year, FY13 is projected to be $2.2 million. I can tell you over the next 5 years, the average is 1.6. So that's probably the planning level that we're looking at. The 1.6 is approximately 17% of your annual revenues. Transfers to other funds. The only transfer we really have at the moment is for the fire fund, which is approximately $70,000 per year, and it has its own charge associated with that. We do have other operating revenues within the system. Before considering Treasure Island, those operating revenues are $500,000 per year. It's turn-on, turn-offs, investment income, those types of things. There are other operating revenues of the system that we look to before we have to look to user rates. The net revenue requirements funded from rates in the middle there for the upcoming year is $11.2 million. We currently have $9.2 million in your revenues from your current rates. So immediately we have a $2 million shortfall, but again, the shortfall was planned. We had planned to use some reserves to help mitigate this over time. We're not proposing using any of your rate stabilization fund in this coming year in fiscal year 13, but we will plan on using 1.1 million from your wastewater capital connection charges. That will still leave a deficit for the current fiscal year of approximately $900,000 or 10% of revenues, which will be funded from the operating fund. Okay, and we've got a schedule of cash reserve balances, so you can see what happens to your cash reserves over time. And when we talk about the scenarios, as I mentioned to you, there were three considerations we were shooting for: cash flow, cash balance, and debt service coverage. All three scenarios end with approximately the same cash reserve balance at the end of the 5 years. So again, the real result is how do we get there, and then what does the customer's bill look like when we consider those scenarios. The financial forecast update, again, looking at all existing and future considerations, customer growth within the system, changes in operating expenses, the capital improvements program, both with Treasure Island and Eastside Forest Main and without, and looking at the availability of the cash reserves to optimize the plan. We basically have about $15.5 million in reserves to help optimize this plan, whether we choose one of the three scenarios that we brought you today or something somewhere in between. Very briefly, and we'll go through the scenarios in detail here in a little bit. Scenario one is very similar to how the budget was put together, and basically it's looking towards the wastewater capital connection charges, what's in the bank today, and what we expect to continue to collect from the 10-20 developers that we have over time, as well as the rate stabilization fund balance, which is around $1.5 million. So we have almost $8.5 million just with those two resources over time to pay the annual debt service payments for the future. And that's really what scenario one does, is we take our reserves and we temporarily pay down, or we use those reserves to make our annual debt service payments. The only weakness in scenario one is that eventually those funding sources dry up. And then we can only look to existing rates to cure that deficiency. Scenario two, what we tried to look at was, instead of using those reserve balances to pay annual debt service payments, to look at what debt service instruments were available to permanently reduce, to pay down the principal on those debt instruments. Now, you know, Henry and I are not financial advisors like your FA, and I've forgotten who they are, but we're not FAs. But we do have a relationship with different financial institutions, particularly with the state revolving fund loan. Henry and I help with the authority securing those debt instruments to expand the wastewater plants that you currently have on the books. And when we look at the SRF loans that you have in place, and based on the reserve balances that we have, scenario two looks at taking out your SRF loan number 3 entirely, to take out the entire loan. It's about $2.5 million roughly to take that loan out, and it would save you $180,000 per year in annual debt service payments. Again, we set rates to cash flow, and $180,000 targets your principal and your interest payments on that particular note. In addition, SRF loan number 2, while the total principal balance outstanding, we don't have enough cash to take it completely out, we could partially defease that note by $3 million, which would reduce that annual debt service payment roughly another $300,000 per year. So again, the idea behind scenario number 2 is to take those reserve balances, to permanently reduce our debt outstanding, to ask FDEP to re-amortize that SRF loan number 2. Okay, so we're not going to wait to get the benefit, 10, 15 years from now. We're going to do it today, and we're going to ask them to re-amortize the note. And in that, your annual debt service expenditures, if you will, immediately would decline about $440,000 per year. So now we don't have that need to meet. And additionally, taking it a step further, because I keep talking about debt service coverage, there's that margin above the debt amount that you're required to keep as well. That goes into rates. So there's two benefits. You take out the principal and interest component as well as the coverage component. And we've run some numbers to try and quantify what those benefits are. Both scenario 1 and 2 are probably two extremes on the bookend. There may be a course of action somewhere in the middle. Both of those cases exclude looking towards Treasure Island and the East Side Force Main. So both scenario 1 and 2 look at very little growth in the system in the near future. Basically trying to dig into your foxhole and hold your own. How do I do that? Do I take these reserves and pay down and use it to pay my annual expenditures and it's going to have a short-term life, or do I use those reserves to pay down the debt permanently? And then lastly, we've looked at scenario 3, which we've done numerous times over the years, and I'd continue to suggest that you continue to look at this, is whether to expand the system, the wastewater system particularly, because the Treasure Island customers are already water customers of the system, but to invest in the East Side Force Main and to bring on Treasure Island through an assessment program. And we do have some slides to talk about how we think that assessment program might look like, but that's subject to change. But when we look at Treasure Island, bringing on just the Treasure Island development would create about $1.7 million in new annual revenues in the form of operating assessment revenues, capital connection charge revenues associated with the investment wastewater treatment plant, guaranteed revenue charges, if you will, for those that will have the service but may choose not to connect. Okay, they will be responsible for at least paying the minimum sewer bill, and then revenues from those that may connect to the system. So over our 5 years through FY17, there's some potential to create some new revenues there. However, to do it, you're going to have to issue some additional debt. At the same token, we're just like scenario 2, when we look at the use of reserves, did it make more sense to apply the $5.5 million that we have in excess reserves to the USDA note in terms of our expansion of Treasure Island and the East Side Force Main? Or did it make better sense to use that same $5.5 million to permanently and partially defease our existing debt? When we looked at scenario 3, it still made better sense to use the $5.5 million to fully defease SRF loan number 3 and partially defease SRF loan number 2 than to apply those same dollars to this future project if and when it takes place. Okay, and that savings is about $165,000 per year by using those reserves, again, to defease the existing debt as opposed to apply it to some future debt service payment. This is just a summary, an order of magnitude, if you will, of the 3 cases. Scenario 1, really, again, what it looks at, and I honestly don't expect that the board wants to go with scenario 1. To wait 5 or 6 years and have an 18% rate increase is probably not the prudent approach, and I wouldn't expect anyone really to support that one. But we wanted to show the 2 realms of possibilities. You could delay a rate increase for 5 to 6 years out into the future by using the rate stabilization fund as well as those capital connection charges. Now, by the end of fiscal year 17, the capital connection charges would basically be fully exhausted. The rate stabilization fund balance would be 0, but you'd still meet your 30-day reserve requirement, your 90-day reserve requirement, your minimum R&R reserve requirement that you have as well. So you'd still be fiscally sound in terms of your cash balance, but you'd still be deficient in terms of cash flow. And you'd need an 18% system-wide increase, which is 11% to the water system, 30% to the wastewater system. Now, as I mentioned to you, 2 years ago was the last time we formally updated this study. And when we looked at something very similar to scenario 1, which excluded Treasure Island and the East Side Force Main, at that time, we were projecting the need to raise water rates 18% and wastewater rates 30%. Obviously, we've had some growth in water revenues, quite honestly, but it's changed slightly. But you know, without doing Treasure Island and without taking advantage of maybe some of the alternatives in terms of paying down some existing debt, the 30% wastewater rate increase is looming out there somewhere. The question is under scenario 1, when do we absorb that cost? Do we do it earlier or do we wait? And scenario 1 is tailored on just showing the order of magnitude if you wait. Theoretically, you need a system-wide rate increase starting in FY18, so this is just beyond our forecast period, or $24 per month for that average bill. Now, the current bill today at 6,000 gallons is $112. At a $24 increase, that bill would go to $137 by fiscal year 18. Again, the average debt per account is $242 per account per year, or roughly $20 per month of the average bill. Scenario 2, again, doesn't focus on any growth in the system, so you have flat growth. It's basically hunkering down, trying to figure out what to do with these reserve balances. And scenario 2 focuses on paying $5.5 million to our existing debt. Our average debt per account would immediately decline to $210 per account per year, which I think is about a 13 or 14% reduction in those costs. The average increase in the bill would need to be 14%, but you need to start next year. And we'll break it out between the water and wastewater system. Cumulatively, it's still 11% on water. Okay, we haven't changed the water forecast, so it's still 11% on water. But for the wastewater system, instead of a 30 to a 31% system-wide increase on sewer, it's only 18 to 19% under scenario 2. And again, we'll show you those details. Scenario 3, dealing with Treasure Island. Now, we're going to take on additional debt. But when we take on that additional debt, we're going to have 2,400 new ERCs that are going to be responsible for contributing towards those costs in one form or fashion. We're going to have operating assessments, capital connection charge assessments. Again, we'll go through those breakdowns. And by the way, those numbers have significant credits in there as well, at least a 35% credit in those numbers that's being proposed, if you will, to Treasure Island, as well as the minimum charges, the guaranteed revenue charges for capacity reservation, and then those that connect, obviously they're going to pay our regular sewer bill. This scenario, scenario 3, again focuses on paying down the existing debt. In this scenario, it looks like you could survive with an annual index. And this board does have an annual indexing provision that's been adopted that's mirrored after the Public Service Commission's annual index, which is published around March or April of each year. By the way, I brought that index with me, and probably the last 15 to 20 years of what that index has been. The index for the coming year is 2.41%. Projected going forward, it's roughly 1.5%, and the projections come from the Congressional Budget Office that has those projections, and it's based on the gross GNP price deflator index. Did I say that right? An index that's been adopted by the Florida Public Service Commission. What I'd like to do is just spend a little bit of time on the next few slides on some overall assumptions that apply to all three scenarios that we talked about. Again, revenue assumptions. We've talked about this. Your current existing revenues from rates are $9.2 million. To balance the FY13 budget as we've projected, we're going to use a $1.1 million from the wastewater capital connection charges. Additionally, we're going to have to use about $900,000 from the operating reserve. Okay, not to be confused because, you know, Basil segregated these funds out into different things. We are not touching the 30-day emergency fund reserve or the 90-day contingency reserve fund. There's a separate account called the operating fund. Those are the monies that the $900,000 are coming out of, which are above and beyond your current policy, if you will, if that's making sense. Again, going into the plan, we have $1.5 million available through our rate stabilization fund looking forward, as well as about $7 million in the wastewater capital connection charge fund. Very little customer growth going forward. We do have some revenues coming in from those remaining 1020 developers. We have not assumed at this point that any of those 1020 developers are connecting to the system, but we are expecting that some payments are going to be received to account for their capital contributions. Operating expenses, again, the budget, $6.2 million for FY13, or 53% of our overall needs from operating expenses. It includes a 2.5% contingency, or about $125,000 per year. Again, that's to help offset some unforeseen items that may be out there. Projected costs going forward from FY14 and beyond. We've got some individual items that we discussed in detail with staff. The weighted components, generally we're expecting those operating expenses to increase about 2.8% per year, about 3% on average over the 5-year forecast. Okay, it's based on some small increases for labor and benefits. Your health insurance is basically capped in terms of what you're willing to contribute to. You just had your briefing on your insurances. We've accounted for a significant portion of that in the FY13 budget. Looking forward, we've made some estimates about what might happen with those costs over time. Keep in mind, you know, our planning horizon, we're basically trying to look at a level-handed approach. Your insurance policies tend to flatten for a few years, then you might have a 10 or 15 or even a 20% jump in year 3 or 4. It's real hard for us to kind of model those kinds of situations. So you might see us plan on a more level-handed approach, but cumulatively, those increases are going to be higher than the average, which the average inflation rate is about 1.8%. Again, this comes from the Congressional Budget Office. And when you take all of these considerations into account, now this is before Treasure Island, because when you add Treasure Island, you're going to have some incremental operating costs. But operating expenses are expected to increase from $6.2 million to $6.9 million by the last year. Now, one way I want to kind of highlight how fixed your operating costs are is if we do expand into Treasure Island, okay, and we're looking at 2,400 ERCs. What we've assumed in our financial snapshot is that maybe 1,200 might connect within those years, so about half. The operating expenses in this last year would only increase to about $7,040,000. So when the investment certainly is capital related, and we're going to create an assessment that's going to help address some of those. But incrementally, to take on future customers, you have very little investment. Most of your investment has already been made in the form of the treatment plants, both water and wastewater. That's where I made the comment on slide 1 that we're underutilized. We're dealing with higher costs on average today than what we might see in the future, because for every new customer we bring on, those average costs decline over time. Capital expenditures, roughly $30 million from FY12 to 17. Now that includes Treasure Island and Eastside Force Main, which is 62% of those costs, or roughly about $18.5 million. Now, aside from Treasure Island, we still have almost $12 million in expenditures, and they may not all be represented here, But some of the major items, you know, you have some water quality issues, some water softening issues that need to be addressed, tank rehabilitation, water line and wastewater collection system rehabilitation. Generally, we need to at least fund from rates on average about $1.6 million per year to address these reoccurring needs. It's not, at least by our advice, to debt fund those types of infrastructure needs. They really should be funded through user rates. And you know, the analogy I use at home is buying my groceries on the credit card. Because what happens is the next month, now I have the credit card bill, but I still have to fund those groceries. And over time, it pancakes. And quite honestly, we do have a number of utilities in the state of Florida that do follow that. You know, I'd come in and I'd say you need to fund $1.6 million from rates. Next thing I know, the finance manager has issued $15 million in bonds and said, we've eliminated the rate increase, which over time, they'll actually end up with one of the highest rates in that given scenario. What we're planning to do is any reoccurring capital needs over time, and we're going to grow into it based on the different scenarios, is fund those needs through your user rates. Now, at the end of the financial forecast, you'll still have your 30-day emergency reserve, your 90-day contingency reserve, as well as your R&R fund. And you will have some modest capital connection charge balances, but certainly nothing to construct a new plan on. This is the summary of the capital funding of the projects. Roughly $12.8 million through a USDA loan. Now we have assumed a 30% grant, which has been staff's recommendation that that 30% grant be used to help provide some credit to the Treasure Island customers in the form of their assessments. But we did account for a credit. Most of the capital plan, about 34%, is what I would call pay-as-you-go. You know, you're having to fund the capital improvement needs straight from rates. Excluding Treasure Island and Eastside Force Main, you'd be almost 100%. You know, basically we don't have expansion-related projects that are out there other than the Eastside Force Main and Treasure Island. There's some small ones, don't get me wrong. There's some line upsizing that we're doing. But constructively, most of this is reoccurring capital needs for our infrastructure. And particularly to maintain our quality of service and our reliability of water and wastewater service. Slide 18 is really where the three scenarios that we have today are kind of tied together. And when we talk about alternatives, you know, we may want to change some of these considerations too. But when we talk about alternatives, I at least try to get them all on the same playing cards, if you will, or the same field of reference. Maintaining your cash reserve policies as adopted by this board. So we're not creating new surpluses. Okay, that's not our objective here. So we don't want to create new surpluses, and we don't want to allow cash balances to fall below the specified minimums that the board has put into place. Again, funding reoccurring capital needs through rates, meeting your minimum debt service coverage requirements on all of your debt. Again, you have senior lien debt, which are your bank notes. You have junior lien debt, which are your SRF loans. They have different priorities in terms of the access to your revenues. And we want to be in compliance with those agreements. Some proposed considerations. This planning horizon is actually one of the first opportunities where we've been able to address how do we want to use those rate stabilization funds? How do we want to use the capital connection charges? We knew the day was coming. You know, historically this has been a planning exercise. We're now getting to that position where we've got an adequate financial position, if you will. And we need to start addressing how we can provide a benefit to the existing customers that have paid into those resources while phasing in higher costs over time. And so that's this proposed consideration. Additionally, trying to shoot for a break-even cash flow by FY17. So we're going to continue to use reserves in each and everywhere. year, no matter which scenario we choose, we're going to be using reserves to meet those needs. Not until FY17, FY18 in consideration scenario 1, are we projecting that your rates will be adequate to meet the expenditure needs in each and every year. One of the main reasons of having that one, we don't want to present a plan to you with some unforeseen rate increase that's kind of lingering out there beyond the forecast horizon that you're not aware of or that hasn't come into picture. So that's the other reason. And then to phase in the rate increases to the extent we can. Cash reserve policies, just to briefly recap, 5% minimum on the R&R fund. You keep this amount in balance at all time. It's roughly $1.5 million. Emergency reserve fund, 30 days of O&M. That's about $500,000 that we maintain. The operating reserve fund, and within the budget document, it's described as the contingency reserve fund. That's 90 days of operating expense, or approximately $1.7 million. When you add those three components together, it's just shy of $4 million in terms of available cash through those resources. In addition to that, in addition to those three items, you also have an operating fund, an operating account. For all practicality purposes, that fund is allowed to go to zero. It's not part of this reserve policy. It's kind of a surplus above and beyond. And so when I mentioned to you in the current budget year we're using $900,000 from reserves, it's that account from which the $900,000 is coming from, so the operating account, if you will. Rate stabilization fund. By policy, we can accrue up to $3 million per year in the rate stabilization fund. Now, to revisit the purpose of the rate stabilization fund. Two purposes. One, to either avoid an untimely and temporary rate impact. Okay, maybe you had a loss or a decline in sales because of some watering restrictions that are temporary, but you expect them to pick up next year. You can draw upon the balances in the rate stabilization fund to meet your lending requirements. Okay, it's an adjustment on Basil's part that he's allowed to do, if you will, that he can draw money from the rate stabilization, I'm sure with your approval, but he can draw from that fund in order to meet those minimum requirements so that an untimely rate increase doesn't have to happen today just because of this little metric that's over here. That's why the rate stabilization fund is there, to avoid those untimely changes. Additionally, it can also be used to help phase in permanent increases going into the future. Now, how the rate stabilization fund works, and I think you made a deposit last year, is in a year that you make a deposit into the fund, those dollars, if you will, are removed from gross revenues in terms of calculating your coverage test. They're still revenues of the system. If you look at the income statement, they're probably in the income statement numbers in terms of revenues. So they have been earned, they were paid. But in terms of this metric that Basil has to opine to, the debt service coverage, he gets to adjust that out. And then in years when that metric might be tight, if you will, that would otherwise force you to raise rates just to meet that metric, he could come back to you and say, can we recall 100,000 or whatever the amount might be? Can we recall this back to gross revenues so we can show that we've met the metric without having to raise rates? So that's really kind of the background of the rate stabilization fund. When we address our various scenarios that we've talked about, we've had to use that rate stabilization fund in a number of different ways. Scenario one, we have to fully exhaust the rate stabilization fund. Now, this current year, that balance is about $1.5 million. In the current budget that Basil and John have put together, in that budget, it's recommended another deposit of roughly $800,000. Our analyses don't look at making that $800,000 deposit because you're actually going to need that money for capital, in our opinions. But basically, we have $1.5 million in scenario one, and we end up fully utilizing that amount by the last year to meet the minimum debt service coverage requirements. By the last year in scenario 1, I pointed out to you that theoretically an 18% rate increase would be needed in FY18 to then bring the system back to par. It's because the rate stabilization fund is fully exhausted. When we talk about the other 2 scenarios, which focus on buying down your existing debt service, and then scenario 3, expanding the system, these 2 scenarios, to a degree, continue to maintain a significant portion of the rate stabilization fund. So not only do you see the lower rate increase needs from scenario 2 and 3 versus scenario 1, but you're actually going to maintain some cash balance, which I think principally was the intent of the board, to then go into FY 18, 19, 20 and offset any other unforeseen costs that might be out there. So what is being used up in scenario 2 and 3 are the capital connection charges. The sewer capital connection charges are being used to buy down the debt service. That's that $5.5 million that I mentioned to you. Scenario 1, again, just to recap, is basically trying to hunker down, maintain the current system as is with no growth, about 3% increase in operating expenses over the next 5 to 6 years, paying your reoccurring capital, $1.6 million per year. How do we do all this? And I've got this reserve balance over here in the rate stabilization fund as well as the capital connection charges, and it's using those resources to pay our annual debt service payments, principal and interest. Now, I know this, I struggled over this chart, and I know it can be a little confusing. The reason I set it up this way is I wanted you to be able to see the revenue sources that you have to meet different needs. And so under scenario 1, this green bar that's here, these are your current rates, your revenues at your existing rates plus other income. Investment income, turn on, turn off fees. This is basically what you should be using to operate your system. The other revenues, for example, the purple line is the operating revenues at existing rates plus any capital connection charges that we use from the reserve fund to help meet some of these revenue requirements. And then the blue line above that is additive, in other words. The blue line above is operating revenue plus the use of capital connection charges plus the use of any rate stabilization funds in that period to again meet the need. So if I apply some numbers to it as an example, your existing revenues, including other income, are $9.7 million on average. That's what they are today. We're expecting very little growth. Between this year and on through, we're planning to use $1 million in capital connection charges next year, another $1.5 million the year after, $2.2 million here in capital connection charges, and $2.2 million here in capital connection charges. I'm not going to have any capital connection charges in FY17 to apply to those payments. Additionally, this blue line, and you can see it overlaps with the capital connection charges, I'm not proposing using any of the rate stabilization fund until year 3, where we're using about $200,000 here. That's the difference between the purple and the blue line. We're going to use another $650,000 in rate stabilization fund here. And then lastly, in this last year, we're still using about $900,000 in the rate stabilization fund to help meet the needs. Now, you can see we still have annual requirements that might be in excess of those amounts, and that's what's coming out of that operating fund that we've spoken about. Now, in this last year, again, the rate stabilization fund balance would be 0. The capital connection charges, for practical purposes, would be 0. You're going to have a small balance, but you're going to need that for upsizing and other things. But basically, those resources are exhausted. And so this deficiency from this top bar to the green bar to your existing rates is $1.7 million.
or about 18.5% of your current revenues. And so that's where scenario 1 is saying, going into FY18, before even considering additional inflationary pressures and other changes that might be out there, this is why scenario 1 is saying you're going to need about an 18% rate increase by year 5 or 6. Because again, you're depleting these resources for a short-term benefit. I mean, this is the scenario that says we don't have to raise rates for the next 5 or 6 years. Now, there may be a scenario 1A, okay, that you could look at, which means you take the 18%, but you start earlier. Okay, you do a little bit over 5 years, whether it's 3.5 or 2.5. I haven't worked the numbers out. But if you start earlier, you could achieve this. With that said, starting earlier would, in general, create a surplus, okay, that doesn't otherwise exist here, which would exceed the current policy. Okay, so again, the current cash reserve policy is the 30 days to 90 days of the R&R fund. So we certainly could start this earlier, but you would accumulate a cash reserve above and beyond what the policy is currently outlined. Right, wrong, or indifferent. I'm just trying to put, there may be capital projects out there that aren't on the table at this time, okay, that may need to be discussed. If that's the case, preferably if they're viable capital improvement projects, I'd like to have them in all 3 scenarios so that we can then start talking apples and apples again. But you could have some variances of scenario 1. Scenario 2, again, it's just like scenario 1, except instead of using those reserves to make annual debt service payments, instead we're going to reduce our principal amount outstanding and our annual debt service payments that are required. Basically, under scenario 1, we have an average debt service cost to our customers of about $242 per account per year. When I say per account, that's per water and wastewater account. Okay, so if you have water and wastewater service, that's double. This is per account. And so it's $20 per month per account, $40 per month per account for the typical bill that's out there. So you haven't even paid anything on your utility bill yet, and $40 is going to debt. And so scenario 2 says, okay, I've got $5.5 million in capital connection charges in the sewer fund. What can I do with these? I can pay off SRF loan number 3. I can partially defease SRF loan number 2. You can see the increments of saving here. It's $441,000 that's saved. It would lower the average cost to $210 per customer account. That's without any growth in the system. That's relying solely on the customers that you have in place today. Now, the difference between scenario 2 and scenario 1 is roughly 4%. Okay, if we choose to instead use those reserves to buy down debt service payments over time, all things being equal, the rates at the end of the forecast period would have to be about 4% higher than what's projected under scenario 2, or roughly $17. Is that right? No, that's not right. $7. I'm sorry, $7 per month higher. Again, rate stabilization fund under scenario 2, you're going to maintain about $900,000 at the end of the financial forecast period, to then go into the next 5 years. 18, 19, 20, you're going to have some balance to address some of those needs. This is what the annual requirements. So scenario 1 was based on, delaying a rate increase for as long as possible. And scenario 1's rate increases out here, FY18, if you will, were 11.2% for water, so you can see that's unchanged here, and about 30% for wastewater. That was scenario 1. Scenario 2 says we're going to pay off debt and we're going to start earlier and use adjustments that look more similarly to inflation. And we're going to make smaller incremental increases to our customer bill over time. And we get to a 14% cumulative rate increase compared to 18% under scenario 1. The bill here would increase about $17 a month over 5 years. So the typical residential bill would go from 112 today to roughly 129 over 5 years, so it'd go up incrementally. Scenario 1 had the bill rising to $137. This is a similar chart in terms of scenario 2. The green bar here, just to not give you too many numbers, this green bar is the existing rates and revenues from the proposed annual increases of scenario 2. So the 2% increases in water, the 3% increases in wastewater, that's captured in this green line. And you can see by the last year, all revenue sources have met the expenditure needs. You're now on a break-even basis, if you will. Your revenues are adequate to meet the needs. And then going forward, you have another $900,000 in the rate stabilization fund to address anything that you haven't anticipated. Now, there are going to be years in between here that we're going to be using some reserves. We're going to be using the purple line here, and each and every year we're going to be using $150,000 a year in capital connection charges to pay annual debt service. So right away we're going to take $5.5 million and lower our annual debt, or our total debt, which will lower our annual debt service payments. We're doing that immediately. If we have additional resources, we're still going to apply it to the debt service payments each year, just like we did in scenario 1. And so we're using $150,000 per year in all the years here, except for the last. And then you do have the need to use some rate stabilization funds. It's mainly capital driven, meaning I don't want to have to raise your rates here to meet this deficiency today when we've got the reserve balances to phase them in over time. And that's what scenario 2 is doing here. Scenario 3, again, relies on growth within the system, expanding the Treasure Island and building the East Side Force Main. You know, East Side, the benefit of scenario 3 versus scenario 2, okay, you still get to the same cash reserve balance at the end of the study period. It provides the lowest projected annual rate increases of the other 2 scenarios. But the benefit of scenario 3 versus scenario 2 is you'll have the East Side Force Main in place for future growth to connect to. Scenario 2 doesn't anticipate that. It's almost as if you abandon the idea entirely, because again, scenario 2, you've used up most of those capital connection charges to pay down debt. So to address the East Side Force Main somewhere in the future, you're going to have to borrow the monies to do that. Where in scenario 3, kind of weights the 2 together. We look at defeasing or paying off some of our existing debt as well as expanding the system at the same time. Okay? And so what it will put us in a position is to have this line, and John, I've forgotten how many ERCs are along that line, but my point is that the infrastructure would be in place in order to be ready for when growth does occur at some point in the future. And again, just pointing out that we probably have 65 to 70% of our treatment capacity idle, if you will, meaning it's underutilized, it's there, it's available for future growth. The long-term plan is to have new connections to the system. Scenario 3 looks at doing that. But it requires some issues, some fortitude, if you will, of initiating an assessment program with Treasure Island. All properties would be responsible for paying the assessment, whether they connect or not. All properties would also be responsible to contribute to the capacity reservation or pay that minimum monthly charge that we've spoken about. And then those that do connect to the system will pay the normal fee over time. Now, Basil, correct me, my mind just went blank. There's some incentives that we're putting in place, aren't there? There's a no-interest loan for 20 years. And I know we've got about 35% outlined in credits, which we'll go through. Were there any upfront benefits to prepaying the assessment?
We didn't talk about any.
We didn't talk about that? Okay, okay. So, you know, basically what we've looked at is a payment plan without interest, or at least we haven't counted on interest income in our analysis, over 20 years. And when we talk about those assessments, they allow for a 35% credit to the total cost for Treasure Island, which includes Eastside Force Main, the capital connection charges, as well as on-site facilities. So it's substantial when we look at that. But again, to make scenario 3 work, we've got to have that $1.7 million in additional revenues that would come from the assessments, would come from the minimum bills, as well as those who we think would connect to the system. You still have the $400,000 in immediate savings in terms of your annual debt service. And again, I looked at it. Do we take the $5.5 million in the capital connection charges, leave our existing debt the way it is, and apply it to the USDA loan and borrow less in the future? You saved more. You saved $165,000 a year by applying it to existing debt, but then applying it to the USDA loan. And so I've got those numbers, but basically, under this scenario, you're saving $400,000 a year, where if you applied it to the USDA loan, you'd only save roughly $300,000. I think it's about $280, $290, but the difference is $165,000. You divide that by the number of customers that you have, and I think it was about $10 per year per account in terms of the savings, defeasing existing debt versus holding out and trying to apply it to the USDA loan. Very important are our initial assumptions on the assessment program. When we've looked at the total cost per connection in Treasure Island, $9,254 is the total cost. It includes their portion of the east, and just their portion. They're not being expected to pay the whole cost of the Eastside Force Main. Their portion of the Eastside Force Main. Their portion of the wastewater treatment costs, capital connection charges. Their costs in terms of the on-site facilities that are going to be expended. The connection charges that are expended. Now, when we looked at this, again, we've assumed that the authority might receive a 30% grant in terms of the total cost of that project. We've been asked to pass that on in terms of the credit to the Treasure Island customers. That's what we've done in our analysis. And so it's probably a conservative approach. Whether this board elects to pass on that total grant to this customer base or not, that's your decision. That credit alone is $2,269 per connection. Then staff also recommended an additional credit of $985, mainly to get to a rounded fee of about $6,000 per connection. So that's what we've relied upon in terms of our future revenues. And again, that's spread out over 20 years, no interest. In terms of what we're accounting on to meet the 5-year financial forecast needs. As I mentioned to you, it's about $1.7 million per year by FY17. $461,000 are going to be capital connection charges. Okay, it'll be part of the assessments. That's for the plant, if you will, and those are going to be reoccurring. And as we collect that $400,000 in each and every year out in the future, we're going to use that $400,000 most likely to pay a portion of the debt service on the USDA loan. $648,000
are expected to come in through other operating assessments, the accrued guaranteed revenue charges, as well as the connection fees from Treasure Island, and also the minimum charges. Okay, that's the customers that didn't connect, that choose not to connect to the system, but still pay the minimum monthly charge, or the GRC, if you will. Combined, that's about $600,000 per year. And then what we've assumed is that about 50% of the customers, 30% in FY16 and 20% in FY17, and it's an assumption is what that is. We've assumed 50% of the Treasure Island customers would connect during our forecast period, okay, and pay the regular monthly rates. That, again, now there is some benefit. If the other 50% of the Treasure Island customers were to connect, you might see an additional benefit somewhere beyond the forecast period of maybe $300,000 more per year in net revenues. Again, as you take on those customers, you're going to have a slight increase in your wastewater operating expenses, but you're going to get a larger increase in terms of your revenue. Now, those customers are already going to be paying the minimum bill. So what we're picking up is the amount of revenue that's coming from the usage charge from those future customers. I think I just covered most of this. This is the growth that we had assumed. So again, we haven't picked up 50% within the financial forecast period. Again, that margin might be about $250,000 a year from additional connections that may connect. Slide 30 is the annual increases recommended for scenario 3. And really it's utilizing what's already adopted and in place today. It's the annual indexing provision. And, you know, the 2.41% is a known number. And like I said, I can call that up here if you have an interest in it. Going forward, as projected by the Congressional Budget Office, 1.5%. Where those actual numbers will fall out, we're not sure. It's a similar metric that we use to project operating expenses. So to the extent inflation might be higher, those indexes would most likely be higher as well. If inflation comes in lower than projected, theoretically the indexes would as well. But this is the metric we're looking at right now, about 8.5% over the 5 years. It would be a $5 increase, $5.36 increase to the cumulative bill, you know, when we look at scenario 3 compared to a 17% for scenario 2, or a $17 increase on scenario 2, or a $24 increase when we consider scenario 3. Scenario 1. Scenario 3 does maintain about $1.1 million in the rate stabilization fund by the end of the forecast period. So again, you'll still have some reserves to mitigate unaccounted for expenditure needs in the future. Similar chart here. Again, the green bar is your existing revenues plus revenues from the proposed index over the 5 years. You can see we're right about the expenditure needs. We're using capital connection charges all the way through, even and beyond 2017. Again, we're expecting that you're going to collect at least $400,000 through the Treasure Island Assessment Program. And so we're allowing ourselves to rely on that revenue stream in future periods. That's what that minor surplus is right here. Those are the capital connection charges that are coming in from the Treasure Island assessments. And then the rate stabilization fund, you can see we used it in 1 year. We had a tight year because of capital, and we needed to use $400,000 of the $1.5 million in the rate stabilization fund to get over that hurdle, so that you then meet all your requirements. But you have, again, you got $1.1 million in the rate stabilization fund to look forward. You've got your 30 days reserve in the emergency fund, the 90 days in the contingency fund, the R&R reserve fund. We spent some time on this one once before. This is just a recap, kind of a big picture of the results. Again,
Cumulative $5 increase in the average bill compared to $17 or $24 increase. This is monthly. These are monthly increases in the bill. This is where I mentioned to you before, all three scenarios basically get you to the same point. And if you're interested, I do have with me the chart that shows you the cash balances year over year, because that's how we track them. But I wanted to show you your beginning and ending balances by scenario. And all the scenarios end with roughly $6 to $6.5 million in total cash within the bank. Now, scenario 1, you'll see is the green area that would have been here. There is no rate stabilization fund in scenario 1. Now again, we said there could be a scenario 1A that's out there where you might start a little bit earlier. Again, there's an opportunity cost there. To the extent you choose scenario 1, your opportunity cost is you didn't choose scenario 2. Scenario 2 said you could have had a 14% cumulative rate increase. Scenario 1 says you need 18. The opportunity cost is 4% or somewhere in between. So there is an opportunity cost there. But basically what we're demonstrating here, and we've got, again, the year over year numbers, we're taking $16 million today. And we're thoughtfully planning on how to use those prior period revenues that have been paid for through our existing customers. How do we provide a benefit to them over time? We know we're deficient today, but we're not suggesting that we raise rates today. We'd have to raise them 10% today to meet the budget right now. And that's using $1 million in capital connection charges. We're not suggesting doing that. We're going to use the $16 million in reserves, phase it out over time so that we're at roughly $6.5 million by the end of our study period. Cash flow is at a break even. We're meeting our debt service coverage requirements. I didn't show you a chart on that, but we're adequate, we're good, we're looking good in the eyes of the bonding community. And we've met our cash reserve requirements that have been adopted by the board, which are, again, are a part of many of those lending criteria that bondholders look to and provides for long-term sustainability of the utility system, as well as your creditworthiness of the system as well. This is just kind of a recap of the annual increases. Again, scenario 1 has NA because really you could forego a rate increase for the next 5 years and manage and get to the same cash or similar cash balances by the end of FY17. The problem is you'd have a jump in FY18, most likely. And while the 30% might feel steep on the wastewater side, again, I've gone back to 2 previous studies that Henry and I have done for you, and on the wastewater system, I can tell you, without Treasure Island, it's always been in the 30th percentile, the 30th percentile in terms of the overall rate increase. So I think what's changing now is we're finding ourselves in a strong financial position where we've got the resources where we need to start addressing, okay, how are we going to, lack of a better word, phase out the ongoing funding. Our purpose isn't to continue to build cash. So we want to find a way where we can use those resources to phase them out thoughtfully, where we get some permanent benefit. And I think that's what the 3 scenarios are intended to do. This is the rate comparison. Again, it's not a scorecard. These are a number of utilities that we've compared against over the years. A lot of them are regionally located to you. None have been specifically singled out, just to quote, have in here. In this particular comparison, you are to the far right. There are a couple utilities in the state at 6,000 gallons that exceed your bill. If your customer's bill were calculated under their rate, they would exceed your bill. under scenario 1 as an example, if we add $24 to this bill and you're at 137, it would probably be one of the highest bills in the state, if not the highest bill. Now, quite honestly, we're not sure where all these other utility systems are going with their rate structures over the next 5 years. Some utilities have planned very well, some have not. Some are in some significant economic hardships. They're not being able to meet their bond covenant requirements, their cash reserve needs, and those kinds of things. All of these issues, those three components that we talked about before, cash flow, coverage, and cash balance, all three of your scenarios will meet every single one of those. The answer is what does the ultimate bill look like? And that's where this can sometimes be helpful. This average, by the way, this survey was conducted in April of this year. So these are the rates that were in effect during April. The average of the survey was $69.41. Again, that's for 6,000 monthly gallons. As you go to all these different utilities, I mean, the makeup is completely different. Water supply resources are different. How they can work with their wastewater system is totally different. The size of the community might be completely different. The age of the infrastructure. You know, there are a lot of utilities around the state that benefited from growth over the last few years, not last few, maybe the last 8 years, where they have a lot of new infrastructure. Okay, they haven't quite had to start funding those replacement needs yet. You know, they're tied to just their minimum 5% of gross revenues, and that's what we're doing in that particular case. Your facility, you had $92 million invested in infrastructure. At least 26% is depreciated. You know, I know staff could probably go through and tell you more about the age of the system and facilities, but we're looking at a need to fund 17% through rates in terms of those reoccurring replacement needs. Taking it up to the end. Really, just the conclusions. You know, numbers-wise, scenario 3 looks better compared to the other two scenarios. 1 and 2 are probably two extremes between the two. You know, do you use all the money to pay down your current debt as opposed to using all the money to make annual debt service payments? Do you do something in between? You know, scenario 1, I don't think anyone really wants to wait to respond to the changing conditions. That's not the intent of scenario 1, but it's trying to describe to you all and to your customers, there is a cost of waiting to respond to this. And nobody wants to have to absorb an 18% water and wastewater rate increase in one particular year. That's why we're doing this planning cycle. And that's, let me pull up the index for you real quick. And then I'll be happy to address any questions or concerns. If you can't see it, I did bring some copies with me. We can pass them out. This is the Public Service Commission's index. It's the same index that was adopted by this board several years ago. What's nice about this, to me, an index is an index, to be honest with you. I mean, really, it's a thoughtful metric to help keep pace with rising costs. You know,
it's an assumption.
It is an assumption. It allows your customers the opportunity to phase in and adapt their behaviors to rising costs over time. Okay, most of them will tell you. We've gone to communities where, you know, somebody will make the comment, "You've been indexing that rate for 8 years. I never knew it." You know, and you get that kind of feedback. When you calculate that to most bills, you're probably talking cents on the dollar in terms of the average bill. Now your bill might be slightly different. We've got a $112 bill at the current index. This is water and wastewater combined. That would be $2.70 if this index was applied for next year. And that's a rough estimate. We certainly could get you an actual rate schedule on that. You can see in prior years, it was slightly lower. Some years it was higher.
What's nice about this is the Public Service Commission has a write-up in here that they publish every year. And by the way, this is published in March. So you know what the number is by the time you're going through your budget process, and you can plan. But the Public Service Commission within the same document has a write-up as to why they chose this particular index over CPI or some other metric. I mean, they have a method to their philosophy. There's a lot of utilities around the state that do have indexing provisions. Now, there are some that have chosen not to index rates during this economic time. Not necessarily my recommendation. I think small incremental adjustments are appropriate, particularly where we find ourselves today. And again, it was planned. Where we're at today was planned. We had planned to meet next year's requirements with the use of reserves. That's always been a part of the plan. But without a doubt, your existing revenues from current rates are not going to be adequate to meet the expenditure needs over time. 53% of those needs are your operating expenses. Okay, about 28% are your annual debt service, and roughly 17 to 18% are your reoccurring capital needs of the system. In the short term, 80 to 90% of the utility costs are fixed. We have to have staffing at the utility plants. In order to make those level of service needs, there are certain things that we have to do. The only true incremental costs that we have in the short term are the utility costs, electricity, chemicals, and those kinds of things. Now, granted, you could make structural changes that could overall impact the budget, but you may have to make some compromises in terms of your overall level of service. And with that, I'll be happy to address any comments or questions.
Who wants to start?
Wow. It's a lot to
Are
absorb.
we making a decision today on this?
Again, just
explain it about, three different ways.
Henry and I would be happy if we need to come back and have a workshop on the issues. We can do that. That's not a problem.
Your assumption is our budget increasing by 15% over the next 5 years? Did you use the 3%?
Cumulatively?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. That's about right. It's 2.5%. It increases roughly $700,000. Now, I didn't pass out all the tables. To be honest with you, it's 200 pages.
Right.
I didn't want to overwhelm you any more than I already had. The way we do the forecasting is really much like Basil does his budget. It's in detail. So when we get to the workshop, if you want to know different, what's personnel costs going up, how much of that, if you have specific needs that you want us to address, we can look at those items. Again,
do we need to give it to you before you come back and tell you what we would like to see?
Through staff would be perfect if that's something you'd like to do.
Yes.
Otherwise, we'll just be prepared.
I mean, there's several scenarios. I mean, we're looking at, what did you say, 16 million?
In terms of total cash that we have available? Yes, sir.
And we're going to need to borrow 12 million on each side of Forest Bank after our 30%?
Yes.
Why couldn't you use about 9 million of the 16 we have and only borrow 3 and get positive income right away?
Now, of the total 16 million, some of that is restricted.
I understand that.
Okay.
I understand that.
In terms of the dollars that you're speaking to, one, assuming we're still meeting our 30 days, 90 days R&R fund metric, what's the number I ran was taking the 5.5 million capital connection charges. What's the benefit of either applying it to the USDA loan?
Yeah, but you're using a 5.5. I'm not.
Right.
I'm using a 9 or a 10 because we only need,
Right.
30% of our annual. We need $3 or $4 million.
Okay. The risk.
We keep 6.
The understanding too, part of the use of the rate stabilization fund that I was using was to continue to get you over some short-term hurdles. So
my question
Right.
is, if you go in and pay $10 million of this 12 million that we're gonna have to borrow, so we borrow 2.
Right.
How quick do we get positive income back from that 1.5 or 1.6 million that we're gonna get out of Taylor Creek? I'm sorry, Treasure Island.
What I would say, your debt service on your USDA loan, okay, doesn't come on until the latter half of this forecast period. Okay, I'm utilizing the monies you have in rate stabilization balance and your other funds. That's going back here.
Right, I understand.
And,
that
so to answer the question, I'm using reserve funds here to get you there. Now your debt service that you're
right,
suggesting that
we this in the last
right,
2 years. I understand
right.
that.
So what will happen is, instead of my being able to raise rates 2 or 3% here, I might have to raise them 10% now
To get there.
to get the long-term benefit, as opposed to phasing it in over time. And so that's why I limit it to $5 million. I have $5.5 million available while using this other cash to phase in rates. If you tell me phasing in rates isn't an issue, then I can take that other $1.5 million, I can add it to everything that you've got, and I can put it to the USDA loan. I'll have to raise rates today significantly, probably double digits, to get my benefit out here to a customer group that may or may not connect. And I'll take all the risk on myself. Quite honestly, you know, when you look at 2 and 3, and something in between, I'm sure, you could take little steps moving forward while continue, you know, and well, first of all, when we look at defeasing the debt, okay, we didn't assume it would happen this coming year, FY13. Okay, so we've planned on some contingency, if you will, that benefit wouldn't start for another year. So FY14.
Basically, we're sitting idle.
We're sitting idle. Yeah. And so, but if I looked at 2 and 3, at a minimum, you could probably move forward with some type of index for this next year and continue to address the viability of moving forward with Treasure Island and Eastside Forest Main. Otherwise, if you decide not to move forward with Eastside Forest Main, you still would be in a good position to follow a similar line along scenario 2, if you will, where you're focused on paying down your debt. But again, the cost of scenario 2 is you're not going to have that line in place. And again, I don't receive any benefit whether you build the line or not. We're here analyzing the different cases in terms of what's going on. But scenario 3 provides the lowest projected rate increase. It relies on you to do the assessment program, okay, which has some teeth to it, but has a lower average increase to the bill, okay, and would put a line in place.
Budget, if we continue our budgets like we are.
And would have that line in place to meet future growth. Now, again, I did look at the scenario, phasing rates with the rate stabilization fund, left me with $5.5 million today that I could do something with. What can I do with this $5.5 million? If I apply it to the existing debt, I would lower our annual debt service payments by $440,000. If I applied it to the USDA loan, which is 40 years at 4%, on a cash flow basis, I saved only like $280,000. The difference was $165,000. Now, I'll grant you this. Between the two, I'm going to pay more interest costs for the USDA loan, okay? Because I'm borrowing 4% over 40 years. Mathematically, that makes sense. The Dave Ramsey approach would say, do it on cash flow, which is what I set rates to, is based on cash flow. And my immediate benefit is by paying down that existing, because I'm going to create $165,000. See, what's not accounted for is that now I've got $165,000 additional margin under this scenario that I'm going to have infinitely. And how does that $165,000 cash flow compare to those interest costs? over time that is going to be paid by a future customer of the system. So I looked at it, and the one that you're talking about, we can look at that too. I can tell you mathematically, we're probably looking at a double-digit rate
Yeah,
increase in the front.
I wasn't taking into consideration that we're 3 years away.
Right. Again, if you ask me which scenario I like, Henry and I really tried to spend our time focusing on the customer bill. What's the best way we can take these resources and provide a benefit to the customer, keep you in the strong financial position that you've worked hard to get to, okay, and have you in a position to be ready to accept growth if and when that growth comes, if you choose to do that.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you.
There's not a way to factor that in, but I think too, and when you do scenario 1 and 2 where you're paying down those debts, they don't, there's nothing in there, or you can't project any future economic downturns in the economy. So you don't know what kind of situation you'd be into. I think that was a good idea, just to take that fixed number and spread it out over that 5 years, and that capital connection charge we've known are going to increase or decrease. I think that's a good number to use. And the other thing that you can't factor in there is natural disasters, because our system is highly subjected to natural disasters, just like power lines or anything else. And those could really set you back. Is there, I don't know if you looked at it, is there a way to re-amortize after that 5th year, even if you didn't pay down any debt, which I'm really not in favor of that right now, but in that 5th year, have you looked at re-amortizing? I don't see a problem with debt with the utility. I mean, that's,
well, Basil might be able to speak to that a little bit better. I know you went through a round of refinancing.
We did that a couple of years ago.
And I don't know if anything is to refinance the SRF loans. Okay, you're getting what, 2.5% right now.
1.9.
Yeah, I mean it's so low it's hard to beat them.
No, I was just saying,
yeah.
Is that a thought that you throw it?
We haven't, because one, if you ask me to re-amortize something, I'm not going to extend the period.
Yeah.
So my only true benefit is to get a better interest rate, okay, and to lower my annual debt service cost. I'll give you a good example. Henry and I were doing a study for another client. The debt really only had a 5 or 6 year window, okay? And we looked at it, we looked at their cash reserve, balances on hand. You know, the principal outstanding was $2.8 million. We had $16 million, just like y'all did. Now, or do. In this utilities situation, they were cash rich, for lack of a better word, but coverage poor, meaning they had no margin above their operating expenses in debt. They didn't have that little margin, that little number I told you that Basil tracks very tightly. And they didn't have a rate stabilization fund either. Well, our suggestion was take $2.8 million or $3 million, whatever it was, pay off that loan. It goes away entirely. Okay, you have no more interest costs. The payment goes away. We were a little late getting in the game. Apparently, the FA had already been there and convinced the city to refinance that $2.8 million loan over the same 5 or 6 years. Now, there was a net present value. That's what they'll tell you. There's a net present value savings. And FA would tell you applying the 5.5 million would provide you a net present value savings on the USDA loan. I'm telling you, using it on existing debt will save your rates, your
That's
ratepayers
what we're after.
today. So ultimately what happened in that particular case, their annual debt service payment did decline because there was a net present value savings for that client. It dropped $50,000 a year, okay? When I could have eliminated $200,000 a year. While they had a net savings on that, we still had to raise rates to meet that blooming metric. When we could have paid it with cash and we could have been done with it. And, you know, FA got some money though. See, I don't do that.
Well,
So I'm not an FA. You know, we're not necessarily, whatever avenue you choose, we don't benefit directly.
No, I know that it costs money to do it, I just
Yes.
was asking. I think that, you know, your analysis, you followed what we did 2 years ago,
Yes.
and I think we're on a pretty secure path. And I would, you know, like to see the future bill go like this, not like this. And like you said, scenario 3 puts you in this downward rate, and that's taking the customer's.
Still raises you 8.5%. That's important
Well,
to look at.
Yeah,
And
but
rate increase is a rate increase.
yeah, but in the past they've projected rate increases before, and we've been able to. I mean, they may say 8, and we may actually go in and adopt 4.5 or 5.
Well, I mean,
and
you
you
go-
adjust it from year to year.
You use the actual budget this year, we're $400,000 below budget, so if we look at actual numbers and cut some numbers, yeah, then we might be able, at the end of this thing, be the same rate we are now with Treasure Island. But we gotta be smart about it.
But that's why I said that we followed that plan from 2 years ago, and the recommendation then was a higher rate increase than we actually took, and look where it's gotten us. I mean, we've been conservative.
You were able to skip a year.
Right, we actually, right.
You know,
we actually-
and like I said, I mean, John and Basil called Henry and I last year and said, you know, here's what our year-to-date results look like, here's what it,
Yeah.
does it make sense to do an update at this point? You know, 12 months later, and it didn't at that given point. It's an estimate, is what we provided.
Exactly.
You know, I personally wouldn't necessarily say you need to update the plan every year, every couple of years, particularly based on what you've been looking at. I think the main key, and I think you'll admit, some of the scenarios are very consistent where we've been a couple of years ago. Consistency in the plan and credibility. And I think that we've got $16 million in the bank. Now that specific dollar value wasn't targeted, but the principles behind it were. It's part of the plan. Now, we had expected to have new customers connect to the system in the form of 1020 accounts, okay? So you know, the original plan was we were going to have new growth in addition to phasing out the use of these reserves. The growth didn't significantly materialize. The costs are still there. Fortunately, we still have the reserves to help deal with them. You're correct. It is an 8.5% rate increase over time. It's not a rate reduction. It's the best of the two scenarios that's been put forth.
Right, using the numbers we're using.
Yes,
Right.
using the numbers we're using.
You know, right now we have basically a plan A, which is Treasure Island. We don't have a plan B if that don't come through. So we're back to scenario 2.
Right.
You know, so as a board, we've got to figure out what happens if this doesn't materialize. Do we take part of this funding and go try to figure out an area that we can get into, or to buy a customer base, for lack of better words? You know, we've got some things to look at, and I definitely want a workshop.
Okay.
Definitely. Go ahead, Tom.
I was gonna say, since this is an informational item, we have 2 other items that are gonna require board action. Is there a way we could cut this, we've got a board member needs to leave.
I'm 30 minutes late for a meeting. I didn't
Sorry.
see this.
Okay.
No, that's not your fault.
That's fine. Yeah, we just need to get with staff and figure out when we're gonna do a workshop and let them handle that with you.
Yes, sir.
Okay?
Yeah,
Thank
Thank
you.
Digested all this.
Thanks a lot.
thank you.
Item number 12, vacuum station number 1 rehabilitation. John?
Mr. Chairman, as a recap, and board members, as a recap for the last board meeting, we had received our bids for the vacuum station number 1, the rehabilitation to replace the collection tank. The bids came in. I believe there is a bid tab here, 4th page in, where Mid-State Mechanical had the apparent low bid of $281,850. There were 4 bids after that, with the next lowest bidder coming in at $306,600 with RJ Sullivan Corporation. During the course of the evaluation, the engineer, Eckler Engineering, looked at the submittals from Mid-State. While they were able to check their references, the references were not necessarily attributed to the type of project that we were requiring. So they asked for additional information, which Mid-State forwarded on to them. And those references were applicable towards our type of project, and all those references checked out. During the course of the meeting, an issue was raised about the need for licensure or the correct license that was raised by another bidder. I can tell you from the outset of that meeting, I did talk to the local building official, knowing that Mid-State had a mechanical license, knowing that the process that was going to be incorporated out there, the majority of it was mechanical in nature. The building official was certainly agreeable to allow a permit to be pulled by Mid-State, since they did have a mechanical license. Also keep in mind that Mid-State had another corporation, Summit, that was joining forces with them, and Summit had a general contractor's license that was being transferred also. So the issue is, where do we sit here today? Well, what's happened in the meantime is that Mid-State has submitted a letter. It is near the back of your package, I believe, where they were requesting that their bid be rescinded along with their bid bond, and that's kind of where we sit here today. In your board package, you have a letter from Eckler Engineering outlining your choices as of today, where you could still award the bid to Mid-State. You could give back their bid bond and their award and award it number 2. You could throw them all out. There's several options that were outlined in Eckler's letter to the board. Doug Hammond, who is the project manager for Eckler Engineering, is here also to answer any of your questions, because I believe at the last meeting, various board members had some questions from the bid packages for the engineer, and we can certainly leave that up to any questions now for the board.
Eckler stepped up and give RJS a pretty good review here. You know, I know they recommended Mid-State is the lowest, but who's the best?
Of this group? Of the 4 bidders or 5 bidders we had, I'm currently working with 3 of them. And out of those 3, I would say the ones that I've worked with the longest would be RJ Sullivan. So I have a lot of experience with them. And they've always done an outstanding job. They're a very good contractor. I think this project is something that they could easily handle. The superintendent lives just north of town, so he's looked at the project, so I'm comfortable with what they could do. As the engineer of the project, when you start through a bid evaluation, you start with your low bidder, your parent low bidder. we didn't find anything in the evaluation where I could toss them and just move to the second little bidder, second parent little bidder. So we didn't do anything with R.J. Sullivan or Warden Smith or Foster Marine or Close Construction. So our evaluation stopped in mid-state once we didn't have anything viable to toss them with, or to bring up a question about it, not necessarily toss them. So if I was going to go to R.J. Sullivan, I've got enough personal history with them or Warden Smith or Foster Marine to be comfortable with recommending any of those. Close Construction, I know Close Construction, they bid on our projects, but I've never had them on a project. So I don't really know firsthand their ability to do the work.
John, he didn't finish out his packet, did he? Did Close Construction finish up, never send you everything you needed?
They, at the time of bid opening, they were deficient on several items. Now, keep in mind, they can add some after the fact, and clearly if it was a minor irregularity, that could be overlooked, or at least not considered.
But if we accept this letter, we should move to number 2, is basically the recommendation from the board and from Eckler.
Certainly from Eckler and from staff, the recommendation, you have 2 choices, and Tom can certainly echo this or add his own opinion, but you would certainly have the choice. We could throw out the parent low bidder and go to number 2, or you could throw out all the bids.
But they've requested that they would like to rescind their bid and their bond, and us release them from their bond. Pretty much, to me, is you let them go. I don't know why
That will take a board action.
Right.
They've submitted an offer. That offer is firm. It can't be withdrawn. after a
Right,
certain
unless we
period,
release them.
Unless you agree to
Right.
release them. So
Right.
your first choice would be, do we let them go or do we award the bid to them? Just because they want out doesn't mean that you have to say, yes, I'll let you walk away.
I believe that we release them and return their bid bond. They at least met the 45-day window. They didn't meet the 24-hour, but you know, at least on that part, I'm comfortable with releasing them, returning their bid bond and looking at it.
Is that a motion?
I move that.
I have a motion by Mr. Huckabee. Okay, as soon as we have a second, then we can go to questions. No second? Okay.
So motion fails for lack of
Motion
support.
fails for lack of support, because I can't second it, right?
You need,
Then what's our option? If we don't rescind them, we want to hold them to this contract?
Well, it's open for discussion.
Melanie's got some
Discuss
questions.
that now.
I wasn't here last month, so I don't understand fully exactly what happened that it cost us $25,000 when releasing.
They were, this is just my opinion. It wasn't a real clear picture. When we got here, first off, they were $25,000 less than, we had 3 right there together. So that was my first question. Secondly, when we got here, we had a letter stating that these 2 companies are now merging, so they'll have a GC, and it just, it was kind of, to me, it was an unclear picture. Reading Eckler's recommendation, there was nothing there that, like, when you read the recommendation of RJS, is we've done lots of work with them. Basically, what they're telling us is they know this company's a good company. There was no really background to with this mid-state group, and then when he got up and spoke, he, and for lack of better words, he pulled the sympathy card on us. And when some folks here questioned being local, he was, to me, less than professional. So that's my take. Randy, you had an opinion?
Pretty much summed it up. I just was not impressed with Mid-State, just the whole professionalism and the way everything's presented.
John?
Generally, when I see a low price like that and everybody else is as competitive, makes me think they've missed something. This gentleman admitted that they were not considering taking the ball out and going through. They had another option, but he wouldn't tell us what the option was.
I think he went back
That
to
caused a lot of clouds.
I'm sorry. But I think he went back to what you originally said about taking it out the door, then you guys come back and said that wasn't possible. Now we're going back to that. So that was another question I had after he spoke. So
Right.
his deal was he's gonna go in and out the door, not take any roof or anything else off.
Right.
But you guys had said that in the beginning, but then you come back and said, we don't think that's possible.
Right, well, what happened in the beginning, we were looking at reducing the size of the tank, and then after reviewing with staff, it was determined that maybe it would be best to keep the tank the same size, and that made it more difficult to go through that door.
Because then he come back and said that he was gonna reduce the size of the tank to get it through in and out the door. John, isn't that what he said?
No, I think what they were gonna do is actually cut some of the tie beam off at the top where the garage door is to be able to slide it through. Once they moved some of the tanks and the pumps out of the way.
Right. But that was not an accepted alternate for them to do. That was something that could only be considered at a point in time after a contract was awarded. As far as the bid documents were concerned, what his contractual requirement was to follow what was outlined in the contract documents.
Okay.
The other would have had to have been something that would have been addressed.
To cut the tie beam, we would have had to went back and
It would have
address
probably
that.
been a change order to be negotiated at a time after award of contract. So I wasn't here, unfortunately, I was out of town, so I didn't get to hear all the discussion that went on here, but
I hate to keep putting you on the spot, but what's your recommendation?
Well, I have to base it on, I have to be kind of impartial, so I have to
Right.
base it on what the requirements of the bid documents were. If you go strictly by the bid documents, I don't see a reason why we would say Mid-State is not qualified to do this project. If I did it by what's my feeling and who do I feel would do the best job with it, based on experiences and who I know and what I've seen done, I would prefer the second little bit. But it's hard, if I would have gone to you and said, throw these guys out, then you could have had these other people come in and say, wait a minute, Mr. Engineer, you didn't follow what it says in the bid documents. That would have been something I could have made recommendations to the board, and you guys would have to come up with a board action, I believe, as a way to move and for dismissing a little bit.
So now when we get down the road though with Mid-State, we've got to come back in and approve them cutting the door, making the door wider. My understanding, he was going to make the tank smaller. Now, I might have misunderstood.
He's a mechanical contractor. His point of view for the project was, let me go in and be a mechanical contractor and not deal with a wall. I'll go in, or I'll remove pumps, I'll do this, I'll do that, I'll move piping. But we haven't really talked about that except for brief conversations. When you start doing that on this project, your existing pumping systems, your existing piping systems have to be utilized and have to be in place to operate a temporary system while you're doing this work. So there are issues with what he was planning to do. If those issues could have been worked out, that's possible, but we hadn't really looked into it. Our focus was, did he meet the requirements of the documents that were prepared? Can he meet the requirement of the document that he bid? He bid 281 based on what's on paper, not with what he planned on bringing as an option after the fact. But so based on the 281, we didn't really consider his option of going to the door. Now, we could consider it after, but it wasn't really part of the evaluation process.
And just to be clear, if I remember reading these bid tabs correctly, his bid of 281,850 was going to the wall. He was prepared to offer a minimal deductive change order to be able to go to the front, the garage door opening. But that would still require them to submit a work plan to the engineer.
And we don't know what that's going to cost us because now we're going to shut down.
Well, but the bottom line is.
Did I understand that right?
His base bid was going to the wall, which many of the other bidders were dealing with. He did have an alternative, a deductive alternative to go to the front door, but that would have required submitting a work plan to the engineer to review and approve, and still bring it back to this board to approve the change order. So we're really, really far down the road from doing that. This evaluation of 281,850 is basically the base bid going to the wall, which at this point, they've asked to rescind that base bid to get their bond back and whether or not this board would approve that. Is that correct? I mean, that's where we're at.
Well, now we're down to 3 voting members.
I know, and my recommendation is it be unanimous on 3 voting members. leaving. Which of these scenarios, from an engineering standpoint, are you the most comfortable with? Letting the first bidder go, returning his bid, and turning to the second highest bid?
I'd be comfortable with that, yes.
I'll just take it one at a time. I make a motion that we release the lowest bid or the bid that we had offered mid-state.
What's your motion?
Release mid-state from their bid.
Allow them to withdraw their bid and the bond.
And, well,
Yeah,
you want to do them together?
well, you're doing the same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
same thing.
The documents allow you to do that, now it's a board report.
Okay, so we'll go ahead, okay, make a motion.
It's up to you.
Release them from the bid and refund their bid.
Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Hoover. that
I'll
we re-
second.
We have a second by Ms. Anderson. All those in favor, aye? Aye.
Okay, and then.
Unanimous?
And then, based on the engineer's recommendation, I make a motion that we award the bid to RJ Sullivan Corporation.
I second.
We have a motion by Mr. Hoover to accept the number 2 bid and seconded by Ms. Anderson. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Unanimous. Done.
Done?
Is there anything else you need?
So I need to continue and prepare a set of contract documents.
Now, can I ask for, just for the sake of timing, Tom asked me, tell me if this is not correct, can the board authorize the chairman or staff to execute such agreements with R.J. Sullivan rather than waiting till the August one?
True.
Yeah, okay, and you need that in the motion.
Yes,
I
sir.
make a motion that we
Authorize the execution.
authorize the execution of a contract with R.J. Sullivan.
By the chairman
By the chairman
or staff?
agreement with the chairman or the staff.
We have a motion by Mr. Hoover,
I'll second.
a second by Ms. Anderson, that we accept the number 2 bid and let staff
Execute the contract.
execute the contract.
Yeah.
So when I put the contracts together,
John.
John is the.
John.
You still have the chairman sign it, but I'll.
Right, so he'll execute, you'll sign it, and legal
Steve
review,
sign it.
and legal review.
I'll review it, they'll sign.
We
Right,
did.
okay.
So we have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. Unanimous, read.
Thanks, sir.
I'll wait on you
Thanks.
to make sure about the contract. Thank you.
Thank you. Item agenda number 13, liquid oxygen.
Mr. Chairman and board members, we currently use liquid oxygen at our surface water treatment plant. We have been under an extensive or lengthy contract since the start of using liquid oxygen with Air Liquide. We have seen several rate increases over the last year under their contractual agreement with us, and we got another one recently, so we took the time to go out to basically the other vendor for liquid oxygen.
There's only 2, right?
Yeah. There's other subs, but they always get them from those
These
two
guys.
players. So, we approached Praxair to give us a quote for supplying liquid oxygen. You have the results here, essentially over the 5-year period, even with this contract that's been reviewed by staff. And certainly that contract has been approved, but at least as far as the review of it, we're bringing it here to the board, asking, for your review and approval that we would switch from Air Liquide to Praxair for supply of our liquid oxygen needs at the surface water treatment.
Air Liquide, do they have an office here, or are they just shuttling it in?
They do not have an office here. And even Praxair, while they have an office here, I would imagine the trucks that we need would be coming in
Yeah,
from.
they also staff here, though.
Well, they have
They have an extensive staff.
Headquarters is in Chicago.
Yeah, but they support our community.
They have a local presence for, a lot of the other smaller canisters, but certainly, bottom line is, they were much more aggressive on their pricing and most advantageous to the OUA.
Right here. Any discussion?
Tom,
All right. Go ahead. You just,
Yeah, I just got a question, John, or Roy. This purchase order terms and conditions is a one-year deal with the right of extension. I've not seen what they call a 5-year contract that you've got here, John. Is there been another contract?
It would be a continuing contract. This is not the actual
Because I saw
contract.
The one that's here and the.
This is just their purchase order proposal.
I know.
But once they're approved, they'll get it. So if whatever the outcome is today, I can go to them, they'll send it, and then I can let it for your
I was about to
review.
say, this is something like generic, looking that they just give everybody, or
Yeah.
whenever they bid something, so,
I'm just trying to get a feel.
Right.
I haven't seen the, all I've seen is this one that you're seeing in here.
needs to include
So-
the contract. Except for we've seen the contract.
well, it's just a
Yeah.
generic thing, I think they just do it.
So, I mean, when it's in there.
Oh,
We'll get the contract in.
Okay.
But the terms will be the same as for, you know, the
I mean-
fees that they're
I
talking
mean, I
about.
like the idea of the 1 year with the 1 year rollovers. I mean, continuing contract, I don't have a problem with that, but I'd like that limitation on the liability in there that I was suggesting.
Right,
I
and
mean, so I'm trying to see what the formal action of the board would be here today. Would it be to change to Praxair period, subject to approval of the contract?
that's what I was gonna.
Okay.
Okay, that was gonna be my motion, and then, how soon do you need to do that? It says here that, I guess their contract is up,
Well, we have a 60-day notice certainly
Yes.
through,
there's something in
Eric
here,
Hughes.
you had to let them notify by,
Nothing less.
so what date do you need to do this? Let's see here, it's like, June. Was it June I saw, or July? Somewhere.
Air Liquide's new contract is in place as of June 1st, the
June,
86
yeah, I
cents.
thought I saw it in here.
Yes, sir.
So,
But they have the 60-day cancellation
Right.
policy, so we can terminate at any time. If we know we're going to Praxair, we can give Air Liquide the notice,
so
start that 60 days.
I guess my question is, so like if we say August 1st, is that what you're saying? August 1st, to change the Praxair, effective August 1st, is that what you're gonna do?
It would be effective whenever either Praxair releases us or they reach the 60 days.
Air Liquide, you mean?
I'm sorry.
Right.
Yes, sir, keep it straight.
So really, we don't
basically,
need
all
a date?
All we need to do is, if we can approve the motion.
Okay, authorize you to execute a contract with the terms that you,
What you're doing is approving, the change of the supplier from Air Liquide to Praxair.
right, I make that motion.
All right, we have a motion by Mr. Hoover,
I'll second.
second by Ms. Anderson. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? None. Carries 3 to 0.
Any more dates?
Items from the attorney.
I only have two things. One, the transaction on the purchase from the Flores, on purchase of the Flores property was closed smoothly, successfully. We now own it. He's got the right to continue to operate, so we don't want the plants and stuff. The second thing, the LVA appeal has been granted another 30-day extension. This is the last of 3 that are available just by telling the court you want the 30-day extension. It'll expire July the 20th. After that, if they want further extensions, it'll be subject to the approval of the appellate court. It's not as easy to get them once you've had three free bites. So I don't know what's going to happen next. That's all I have to tell you.
Okay. Items from the executive director.
Other than a few customer letters that's in your board package, I can tell you that we are still trying to find testing laboratories for the 24-inch pipe that's first on Southwest 16th.
The second one.
Yeah, the first one was law, it's gone, and it's been there, and I have to go back, but the second verse, we're trying to find testing labs. The only 2 that I've been able to find so far, one's in California, the other one's in Ontario, Canada. And so the real issue is transport costs. Walpole said they would give us some trucks for free to get them.
That would be good if I went to California, but I don't. Now, if you want to put a little piece, I can probably get it on an airplane out there for you.
We're trying to ascertain what the transportation costs. We already know the expected testing lab costs are in the order of $7,000. So,
Well, it's 3,500 miles anywhere you go out there, so.
yeah, so
It's a 20-foot stick.
that's what we're trying to determine, whether we can get by with something much less, which will drop the expected delivery charges from, say, $5,000 to something much more manageable. But
It's unclear what they were wanting. I mean, they wanted 2 samples. Do they want the whole pipe? Do they want pieces? John, you're still trying to get your information.
When they ask for some pictures, which we will get transmitted today, I've gotten a couple in the meeting here, so we'll get those sent out. But we're still progressing. The bottom line is we're still progressing to try to figure out what the cause of this is.
It might be easier to cut it up than UPS it.
Well, actually, the freight we got was from UPS, but the
That's at one link.
Yeah, but so, in that one link, there's 1,300 pounds. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not even right. So we're still progressing, trying to find the testing labs and getting it wiped out.
You'd think they wanted one piece, wouldn't you?
You would think, but who knows?
I don't,
Anyway, that's what we said with it.
Okay, I see that, like you say, we got the letters from employees. It's always nice to get letters from people who are complimentary of our employees.
you need to ask them how things are going with Pine Ridge.
Yeah, how are things going with Pine Ridge? And
I've been meaning to ask
remember now,
this.
we've got only 30 minutes and I'm going to eat lunch.
Oh, okay.
Well, I've got about 60 slides here. Pine Ridge, obviously there's, on the water side, everything is moving along. It's both in the operation of the plant, delivery of the product, and the billing, that's going smoothly.
How's the collection?
In the last page of
Ed McMahon here leading me into this. The problem that we're having is we're going out for bids right now to repair the collection system. It leaks. There's roots in it, there's broken joints, there's defective manholes. There is a problem with it. We have obviously entered our rainy season. And where that leads us is we get an exorbitant amount of flow at the treatment plant.
Pond fills up.
Pond fills up and then it overflows. Then we get DEP threatening us. And I get ready to tell them, I'll send you an abandonment form and you can have it back. But so the issue is, we still need to fix the collection system, replace some manholes, and hopefully by the next board meeting I'll have that pricing back.
Instead of repairing and fixing all that stuff, wouldn't it be imperative on our part to go ahead and appropriate some dollars to go ahead and start a design for the water and the sewer replacement of the piping in there and be done with repairing and replacements?
You can't do anything till we have ownership. You know,
I would.
We can go ahead and start that.
What I could do for you is, I've never looked at the wastewater issue. We did some preliminary looking at replacement of the water lines. I could bring those back to you. There's several options on the water system that we could either do a little bit or all of it. I can get those back and bring those back to you. But I can then look at the wastewater and see what options are available there as far as pumping it back to the system. And bring all that back to you with an estimate of cost of the next board meeting.
Can you go ahead and do that? I think that's gonna be our best bet, instead to just keep looking back.
We don't.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
And in particular, when you start building, when you start having to rebuild those manholes, I mean, you're just one Band-Aid after another. So if we can go ahead and get our plan, you can do all that. We don't have to have it engineered, and you can do it with our personnel.
On the water main, that's not an issue.
Right.
On the wastewater, we typically don't get into that type of construction.
No, that's
We
But
don't.
if you're getting it repaired, couldn't we hook into it with our system is what I'm getting at. I mean,
Well,
If it's, the repairs are done correctly, would we be able to hook into that existing system with our system?
that is something that we would have to consider. If we could repair the existing collection system, whether we built a pump station and pumped it, say, to the City Commerce Park,
Right.
or if we put in a pump station and let's say we built the east side force main, which is going right by that facility, and tie into it, those are two other options.
But for, Tommy, I understand what Tommy's saying, but if we're gonna go ahead and have, as a receiver, we gotta get it fixed. We get it fixed to a standard where our system will accept it, where it'll work in our system.
That is correct.
Okay.
Okay, so what you're gonna do is you're gonna go ahead and put design together for the water? So we need to go up
Almost.
Danielle Road and
Yeah.
turn back to
Yeah.
the west.
Where are you?
No, the church on this.
Right, but they're just gonna loop them together.
Right, we'll tie them together. I'll do the
Yeah.
concept for the
It's
water.
like 17.
I'll do the concept for the water distribution
Okay.
and the concept for the wastewater with an estimated price for both.
Okay, you go ahead and yeah, I think we need to go ahead and get that started. And then as far
either
as the
that
sewer,
or
we're just
or
gonna
ask
patch it
him- ask-
until.
That'd be repaired. He's getting prices on repairs, right?
Yes, sir.
Hey, just ask him if he's got another, he can pay for
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
it. Okay, go ahead and do that. All right, thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
And then go ahead and do the waste collection, repairs that are necessary, but we'll go ahead and get ready to, appropriate some money and get that design started.
We'll come up with those costs and we can deal with that the next
Well,
month.
let's go ahead and do the water now,
Good.
and come on.
You misinterpreted my collection. I'm talking about the green stuff. Money.
Are they paying?
Oh,
Money
yeah.
collection.
Yeah, how are those going?
How is money
I'm
collection?
sorry, we're supposed to be charging.
Yeah, you are. Because if you're talking about these other things, these need to come out of that pot of money.
I thought they were paying for that in their
The
life.
collections, as I understand it, during the last month went well. We had, I'm gonna guess there was probably 80 bills approximately set out with the master meters. And we had 2 that were not paid.
Right.
Is that about correct? So it's doing well, the collection. What we still are working on is where are we tracking with the revenues versus our everyday operating expenses.
Well, that underlies what Tommy was talking about, and that's why I was following up to ask about the dollars, so.
And there is a segment, which page?
On page 16, the last page of financial.
Of the finance report, we've added a new page to that dealing specifically with Pine Ridge.
Okay.
So that we can, as a receiver, we can track the
Correct.
expenses and the revenues.
Yes.
Because obviously, as we've talked about before, we're the receiver and not the owner.
Okay.
Okay, so you're gonna go ahead and get that started.
Yeah, we'll get that
We'll know
started.
where we can go, and then maybe within the next so many days, or after the next meeting, we get started on putting that in.
If that's the direction.
Yeah, I
that's
think
given
that's
us,
the way it's gonna go with that water. And then the only other thing that I had was all the scope of the building down there. And are we gonna be looking at, if that deal of Tandy goes, which, you know, that's probably a fairy tale anyhow, but that's my personal opinion, but if they start planning that project down there like they're doing,
Who's gonna pay us?
that's exactly, that was my question, and I know that there's some repairs that need to be made down there to that system, like on the tank and stuff we talked about several months ago, and I don't know where you're at with
there are some repairs that are required with our recent permit renewal.
that. Right.
Cosmetic, maybe.
Right.
Some handrails that need to be sandblasted and painted and things of that nature. Very cosmetic. I've had some preliminary discussions with the design engineer for the proposed project in Okatani, and I've shared with them that whatever they're planning to do down there will require some significant modifications and improvements to that treatment plant, which, as I shared with him, should be on their dime. As far as the need for phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, took it to believe that their long-term design element was to get rid of that plant, create a pump station, and a force main to tie into our system. But the short term, whichever phase they start with, is going to require some significant improvements to the Okeechobee plant.
And then just curiosity, the capabilities of that plant would do phase 1 and 2 down there that they're proposed?
Not without improvement.
Not without improvement. Is there adequate pipe from that facility to our wastewater treatment plant?
Even if they were to pump it to it,
If they
they would have to install that.
If they put the pipe is in the ground, there's no pipe.
If you're talking about going from Okeechobee tying into our regional system,
Right.
there is no piping connection.
Okay.
So they'd have to come all the way to
Yeah.
Probably close to Palm Village Range.
Palm Village and
Palm Village to tie in, so that, and then the other question I had is, on a site like that, was there any discussion on, individual meters, or are you talking master meter system down there?
Currently a master meter.
Master meter, and then, and then the same thing would be on the wastewater leaving the site, but it would all come under the flow in as the same flow out or whatever.
They would have to correct the deficiencies in the collection system or put in a new one, and so then that's where it would match up. Yes,
So
sir.
they'd actually have a line going all the way. They would have to install a line from there to hook onto our system. And how would we charge? So they're
selling those,
They're
right?
selling those. Well, that's the proposal. To sell those lots. So how would we charge per lot on hookup on something like that?
Be the same as you're doing in Treasure Island, wouldn't it?
Well, it'd be very similar to what
Because it's owned.
It would be very similar to what we did with Silver Palms,
Right.
where they went away from any master meter account because there was a conflict between a master meter and providing fire protection. They couldn't do both on a
Right.
master meter. So we had to go to individually metering the lots, and of course then the wastewater is tied into that individual meter on each lot, or serving each business.
So each lot that was purchased, that buyer would pay us for
Or 8,500 or whatever
Our
it is.
capital connection charges.
and then are we gonna,
Percentage of an FT.
Yeah.
would we get money up front, or do they need to buy some, connection capacity? I mean,
Let me see if I can answer this way.
ERCs.
Each individual lot,
Right.
when it is sold, they will pay their water and wastewater capital connection charges. And if the developer did not pay for the installation of the water meter or the connection, they would pay that. But typically, the developer would pay that upfront. They
But
would do the installation.
The developer wouldn't have to come buy hookups from us, if that's what you're asking, Tommy, the ERC?
That is correct. When they sold the lot,
Yeah.
and we actually dropped in a meter, that new lot owner would be paying us those meters.
Yeah, so
So you wouldn't have to buy one.
you would have we would get paid when they sold a lot, that's what you're saying? Not
We
when
would
they
get the
bought.
capital connection charges at that time, yes, sir.
Okay, and,
Now, if Okeechobee, let's say they use that for the first phase, the developer would have to pay for those corrective actions.
okay, is that something that, would we, I don't know what the agreement is down there with the county, but if they started phase 1, that plant capacity would do 100 units. So then they do phase 2, that's another 200 units, and that plant capacity down there. At what point, I guess what I'm trying to say is, what point would we have to say that plant has exceeded its capacity, you got to run a pipe? Are you telling the developer that he needs to run the pipe before he starts construction?
That would all be worked out during the design before they even built phase 1. because we would need to know what phase one entailed, how many units, versus what was the capacity of that plant to be able to handle it. I think that plant is rated, again, I'm somewhat confused, but I think I was rated at 30,000 gallons a day. So we would look at the current capacity that's exercised or needed by Scott Driver and Lightsey's and or the bait shop if it stays on, then that would give them the available capacity.
That was my next, that's where I was leading, so at some point, that line had to be put in, because then we have an obligation to service what does exist down there for the county, and the construction part of it would not be allowed to impede in any way what we already do for the county down there.
Whether we have our obligations to.
Well, yeah, and so.
That is first and foremost, that happens anywhere, but
Yeah.
clearly in this case, there is a capacity that's been allocated to Scott Driver, Lightsey's, the tackle, the bait, the shop that's down there.
Right.
That would be of first and foremost, that would be the first
That's our
phase.
primary concern.
So that's why I say during the design element, looking at phase one and any subsequent phases is when we would have to design in whether they refurbish Okeechobee or they look at replacing it with a pump station and low enforcement.
Okay.
So that would happen, I would hope, early on before any construction was ever even
Before
contemplated.
they start turning dirt, we gotta know.
I know it's getting late, but just one other quick thing. Pump station, one pump station, push it that far?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm curious.
Yes, sir. We used to, before we built like the station out at the soccer field, SE2, which is on southeast 6th Street, I think, used to pump from there all the way to Cemetery Road.
Okay, I was just curious.
The only problem is obviously either a bigger pipe diameter or bigger pumps. I mean,
Yeah.
Something's got to give somewhere.
Right.
Okay. Well, I just want to make sure. So there's nothing there.
Anything from the public? Okay, meeting adjourned.